Chapter 18 of The Glory of Clementina Wing by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 18. Let us take the case of a refined and sensitive man who has fallen, as many have fallen, under the influence of drink. Let us suppose him to have sunk lower and lower into the hell of it until delirium tremens puts a temporary end to his excesses. Let us suppose him to be convalescent, in sweet surroundings, in capable hands, relieved, for the time at least, by the strange gold drug of his craving for alcohol. His mind is clear, his perceptions are acute, he is once more a sane human being. He looks back upon his degradation with wondering horror. It is not as though he has passed through a period of dark madness of which the memory is vague and elusive. He remembers it all the incidents, all the besotted acts, all the benumbed, enslaved surrender of his soul. His freed self regards perplexedly the self that was in bondage. They are two different entities, and yet they are unquestionably the same. He has not been mad, because he has felt all the time responsible for his actions, and yet he must have been mad so to dishonour the divine spirit within him. The latter argument prevails. I have been mad, he says, and shivers with disgust. In some such puzzled frame of mind did Quicksters, freed from the obsession of the idea, regard his self of the last few months. He remembered how it had happened. There had been several shocks: the Marrable disaster, the discovery of Angela and Hammersley's betrayal, that of the disloyalty of his 3 pensioners, the cynical trick of his uncle. He remembered toying with the idea on his homeward journey, the farcical faithlessness of the drunken housekeeper, and then, click, the hag idea had mounted on his shoulders and ridden away with him, as alcohol, the very devil himself, rides away with the unresisting drunkard. Every action, every thought of this strange period was clear in his memory. He could not have been mad, and yet he must have been. To strain the analogy a trifle, the nightmare in the train and the horror of the morning had been his delirium tremens. But here the analogy suffers a solution of continuity. From that climax of devil work the drunkard descends but slowly and gradually through tortures innumerable to the normal life of man. Shock is ineffective. But in Quickster's case there was a double shock, the seismic convulsion of his being at the climactic moment, and the sudden announcement of that which to all men born is the only absolute, final, immutable. And then, click! The hag that had ridden him had been thrown from his shoulders, and he had looked upon the dead through the eyes of a sane man. And now, through the eyes of a sane man, he regarded the incredible spectacle of his self of yesterday. He turned from it with shivers of disgust. He must have been mad. A great depression came upon him. He had suffered grievous wrongs, it is true. No man since Job had been more sorely afflicted. The revelations of human baseness and treachery had been such as to kill his once childlike faith in humanity. But why had loss of faith sent him mad? What had his brain been doing to allow this grotesque impulse to overmaster it? At the present moment, he assured himself, he had neither more nor less faith in mankind than when he had walked a maniac through the London streets, or during last night's tortured journey in the train. Yet now he desired to commit no wickedness. The thought of evil for evil's sake was revolting. The self that he had striven to respect and keep clean all his life had been soiled. Wherein lay purification? Had he been mad? If so, how could he trust his memory as to what had happened? By the grace of God, those acts of wickedness whose contemplation he remembered had been rendered nugatory. Even Tommy had not materially suffered, seeing that he had kept the will intact and had placed £2,000 to his banking account. But could he actually have committed deeds of wickedness which he had forgotten? Were there any such which he had committed through the agency of the 3 evil counsellors? He racked his memory in vain. The time at Marseilles passed gloomily. Pointer, the Good Samaritan, started the first evening for Devonshire to satisfy his hungry soul with the unutterable comfort of English fields. Clementina and Quickster saw him off at the station and walked back through the sultry streets together. The next day he was left much to his own company, as Clementina broke the news of death to the child, and stayed with her for comfort. He wandered aimlessly about the town, seeking the shade and wrapping himself in his melancholy. When he saw Sheila in the afternoon, she was greatly subdued. She understood that her father had gone to heaven to stay with her mother. She realized that she would never see him again. Clementina briefly informed Quixtus of the child's grief, how she had cried and called for him most of the morning, how she had fallen asleep and had awakened more calm. To distract her mind and to give her the air, they hired a taxicab and drove on the Corniche road past the Restaurant de la Réserve. Sheila's tiny body easily nestled on the seat between them, and she seemed comforted by the human contact. From Pinky she also derived great consolation. Pinky was stupid, she explained, and she couldn't talk, but really she was a fairy princess, and fairy princesses were always affectionate. Pinky was stuffed with love as tight as she could hold. "Have you ever been in a motor car before?" asked Quixtus. "Oh, yes, of course I have," she replied in her rich little voice. "Daddy had one in Shanghai. He used to take me out in it." Then her lips quivered, and the tears started, and she flung herself weeping against Clementina. "Oh, Daddy, I want my Daddy." The essential feminine in Clementina sprang to her arms. "Why did you start her off like this by talking of motor cars?" "I'm dreadfully sorry," said Quixtus, "but how was I to know?" "Just like a man," she retorted. "No intuition worth a cent." At dinner, a melancholy meal, theirs was the only table occupied in the vast, ghostly salle à manger, she apologized in her gruff way. "I was wrong about the motor car. How the deuce could you have known? Besides, if you had talked to the child about triple expansion boiler, her daddy would be sure to have had one at Shanghai. Poor little mite." "Yes, poor little mite," said Quixtus meditatively. "I wonder what will become of her." "That has got to be our lookout," she replied sharply. "You don't seem to realize that." "I don't think I do quite, even after what you said to me yesterday. I must accustom myself to the idea." "Yesterday," said Clementina, "you declared that you had fallen in love with her." "Many a man," replied Quixtus with a faint smile, "has fallen in love with one of your sex, has not in the least known what to do with her." The grim setting of Clementina's lips relaxed. "I think you're becoming more human. And talking of humanity, there's a question that must be cleared up between us before we settle down to this partnership. Are you intending to keep up your diabolical attitude towards Tommy Burgrave?" The question had been burning her tongue for over 24 hours, from the moment that he had appeared in the vestibule the day before, after his sleep, and seemed to have recovered from the extraordinary nervous collapse which had aroused her pity. With considerable self-restraint she had awaited her opportunity. Now it had come, and when an opportunity came to Clementina, she did not go by 4 roads to take it. Quixtus laid down his knife and fork, and leaned back in his chair. Knowing her attachment to the boy, he had expected some reference to his repudiation, but the direct question disconcerted him. Should he have to render equally sudden account of all the fantastic iniquities of the past? Then something he had not thought of before entered his amazed head. He had never countermanded the order whereby the allowance was automatically transferred from his own banking account to Tommy's. He had intended to write the letter after having destroyed the will, but his reflections on plagiarism and wickedness which had led to the preservation of that document had also caused him to forget the other matter entirely, and he had not thought of it from that day to this. "As a matter of fact," said he, looking at his plate, "I have not disinherited Tommy. I have not discontinued his allowance, and I have placed a very large sum of money to his credit at the bank." Clementina knitted her brows and stared at him. The man was a greater puzzle than ever. Was he lying? If Tommy had found himself in opulence, he would have told her. Tommy was veracity incarnate. "The boy hasn't a penny to his name, nothing except his mother's £50 a year." He met her black, keen eye steadily. "I'm telling you the facts. He can't have inquired about his bank balance recently." He passed his hand across his forehead as realization of the past strange period came to him. "I suppose he can't have done so, as he has never written to acknowledge the large amount of money." But the man was telling the truth. It was mystifying. "Then why in the name of Bedlam did you play the fool with him like that?" "That is another matter," said he, lowering his eyes. "For the sake of an answer, let us say that I wanted to test his devotion to his art." "We can say it as much as we please, but I don't believe it." "I will ask you, Clementina," said he courteously, "as a great personal favour, to let it pass at that." "All right," said Clementina. He went on with his dinner. Presently another thing struck him. He was to find a plaguey lot of things to strike him in connection with his lunacy. "If Tommy was penniless," said he, "would you explain how he's managed to take this expensive holiday in France?" "Look here, let us talk of something else," she replied. "I'm sick of Tommy." Visions of Tommy's whooping joy, of Etta's radiance, when they should hear the astounding news, floated before her. She could hear him telling the chit of a girl to put on her orange blossoms and go out with him at once and get married. She could hear Etta say, "Darling Clementina, do run out and buy me some orange blossoms." Much the two innocents cared for darling Clementina. There were times when she really did not know whether she wanted to take them both in her arms in a great splendid hug, or to tie them up together in a sack and throw them into the Seine. "I'm sick of Tommy," she declared. But the normal brain of the cultivated man had begun to work. "Clementina," said he, "it is you that have been paying Tommy's expenses." "Well, suppose I have," she replied defiantly. She added quickly, womanlike, divining the approach to Tommy underlying Quicks's challenge. "He's a child, and I'm an old woman. I have the deuce's own job to make him accept. I couldn't go careering about France all by myself. I could, as a matter of practical fact. I could career all over Gehenna if I chose. But it wouldn't have been gay. He sacrificed his pride to give me a holiday. What have you to say against it?" A flush of shame mounted to Quicks's cheek. It was intolerable that one of his house, his sister's son, should have been dependent for bread on a woman. He himself was to blame. "Clementina," said he, "this is a very delicate matter, and I hope you won't misjudge me. But as your great generosity was based on a most unhappy misunderstanding—" "Ephraim Quickstus," she interrupted, seeing whither he was tending, "go on with your dinner and don't be a fool." There was nothing for it but for Quickstus to go on with his dinner. "I tell you what," she said after a pause, in spite of her weariness of Tommy as a topic of conversation. "When Tommy met you in Paris he didn't know what you've just told me. He thought you had unreasonably and heartlessly cut him adrift. And yet he greeted you as affectionately and frankly as if nothing had happened." "That's true," Quickstus admitted. "He did." "It proves to you what a sound-hearted fellow Tommy is." "I see," said Quickstus. "Well?" "That's all," said Clementina, "or if it isn't, it ought to be." Quickstus made no reply. There was no reply possible, save the real explanation of his eccentric behaviour, and that he was not prepared to offer. But Clementina's rough words sank deep in his mind. Judged by ordinary standards, his treatment of Tommy had been unqualifiable, Tommy's behaviour all that was most meritorious. In Tommy's case, wherein lay the proof of the essential depravity of mankind? His gloomy faith received a shock which caused him exceeding discomfort. You see, if you take all the trouble of going mad for the sake of a gospel, you rather cling to it when you recover sanity. You are rather eager to justify to yourself the waste of time and energy. It is human nature. After dinner she dismissed him. He must go out to a cafe and see the world. She had to look after the child's slumbers and write letters. Quickstus went out into the broad, busy streets. The Canebière was crowded with gasping but contented citizens. On every side rose the murmur of mirth and cheerfulness. Solid burgesses strolled arm in arm with their solider wives. Youths and maidens laughed together. Swarthy workmen with open shirt-collars showing their hairy throats, bare-headed work-girls in giggling knots, little soldiers clinging amorously to sweethearts. All the crowd wore an air of gaiety, of love of their kind, of joy in comradeship. At the thronged cafes, too, men and women found comfort in the swelter of gregariousness. Night had fallen over the baking city, and the great thoroughfare blazed in light, from shop windows, cafes, street lamps, from the myriad whirling lamps of trams and motors. Above it all the full moon shone splendid from the intense sky of a summer night. Quickstus and the moon appeared to be the only lonely things in the Canebière. He wandered down to the quay and back again in ever-growing depression. He felt lost, an alien among this humanity that clung together for mutual happiness. He envied the little soldier and his girl gazing hungrily, their heads almost touching, into a cheap jeweller's window. A sudden craving such as he had never known in his life awoke within him, insistent, imperious, a craving for human companionship. Instinctively he walked back to the hotel, scarcely realizing why he had come, until he saw Clementina in the vestibule. She had stuck on her crazy hat and was putting on her white cotton gloves, evidently preparing to go out. "Hello, back already?" "I have come to ask you a favour, Clementina," said he. "Would it bore you to come out with me, to give me the pleasure of your company?" "It wouldn't bore me," replied Clementina. "Precious few things do. But what on earth can you want me for?" "If I tell you, you won't mock at me?" "Only mock at you, as you call it, when you do idiotic things. Anyhow, I won't now. What's the matter?" He hesitated. She saw that her brusqueness had checked something natural and spontaneous. At once she strove to make amends, and laid her hand on his sleeve. "We've got to be friends henceforth, Ephraim, if only for the child's sake. Tell me." "It was only that I have never felt so dismally alone in my life as I did in that crowded street." "And so you came back for me?" "I came back for you," he said with a smile. "Let us go," said Clementina, and she put her arm through his, and they went out together and walked arm in arm like hundreds of other solemn couples in Marseilles. "That better?" she asked after a while, with a humorous and pleasant sense of mothering this curiously pathetic and incomprehensible man. The unfamiliar tone in her voice touched him. "I had no idea you could be so kind, Clementina. Yesterday morning when I was ill, I can scarcely remember, but I feel you were kind then." "I'm not always a rhinoceros," said Clementina. "But what am I doing that's kind now?" He pressed her arm gently. "Just this," said he. Then Clementina realized, with an odd thrill of pleasure, how much more significance often lies in little things than in big ones. They walked along the quay and looked on the island of the Château d'If, standing out grim in the middle of the moonlit harbour, turned up one of the short streets leading to the Rue de Rome, and so came into the Canebière again. A table, just vacated on the outer edge of the terrace at one of the cafes, allured them. They sat down and ordered coffee. The little sentimental walk, arm in arm, had done much to dispose each kindly towards the other. Quixtus felt grateful for her rough yet subtle sympathy. Clementina appreciated his appreciation. The atmosphere of antagonism that had hitherto surrounded them had disappeared. For the first time since their arrival in Marseilles they talked on general topics. Almost for the first time in their lives they talked of general topics naturally, without constraint. Hitherto she had always kept an ear cocked for the pedant, he for the scoffer. She had been impatient of his quietism, he had nervously dreaded her brutality. Now a truce was declared. She forbore to jeer at his favourite pursuit, it not entering her head to do so. Quixtus, a man of breeding, never rode his hobby outside his ring, except in self-defence. They talked of music. A band was playing in the adjoining café. They discovered a common ground in Bach. Desultory talk led them to modern opera. There was a little haunting air, said he, in Enjoué de flûte. "This?" cried Clementina, leaning across the table and humming it. "You're the only English preacher I've come across who's ever heard of it." They talked of other things, of travel. Her tour through France was fresh in her mind. Sensitive artist, she was full of the architecture. Wherever she had gone, Quixtus had gone before her. To her after astonishment, for she was too much interested in the talk to consider it at the time, he met her sympathetically on every point. "The priceless treasures of France," said he, "are the remains of expiring Gothic and the early Renaissance. Of the former you have the Palais de Justice at Rouen, which everybody knows, and the west front of the Cathedral of Vendôme." "But I've just been to Vendôme," cried Clementina. "That wonderful flamboyant window." "The last word of Gothic," said Quixtus. "The funeral pyre of Gothic, that tracery. The whole thing is on fire, it's all leaping flame, as if some god had said, 'Let this noble thing that is dead have a stupendous end.' Vendôme always seems to me like the end of the Viking. They've sent the hero away to sea in a blaze of fire." Richelieu, the little town not far from Tours, where everyone goes, yet so unknown, built by the great cardinal for his court, and to-day standing with hardly change of stick or stone, just as Richelieu left it, Quixtus had visited. "But that's damnable!" cried Clementina. "I thought we had discovered it." He laughed. So did I, and I suppose everybody who goes there views it with the eyes of a little Columbus. What did you like best about it? The pictures of the past it evoked, the cavalcade of Richelieu's nobles, all in their Louis XIII finery, the clatter of the men-at-arms down that broad, cobble-paved central street. The setting was all there. It was so easy to fill it. That's just what Tommy did, said Clementina. Tommy made a fancy sketch on the spot of the cardinal entering in state in his great heavy carrosse, with his bodyguard around him. This led them on to pictures. She found that he was familiar with all the galleries in Europe, with most of the works of the moderns. She had never suspected that he had ideas of his own on pictures. He hated what he called the nightmare of technique of the ultra-modern school. Clementina disliked it also. All great art was simple, he remarked. Put one of Hobbema's sober landscape, the St. Michael of Raphael, amidst the hysteria of the Salon des Indépendants, and the four walls would crumble into chaotic paint. Which reminds me, said he, of a curious little experience a good many years ago. It was the first international art exhibition in London. Paris and Belgium and Holland poured out their violences to unfamiliar eyes. Mine were unfamiliar at any rate. There were women sitting in purple cafes with orange faces and magenta hair. There were hideous nudes with muscles on their kneecaps writhing in decadent symbolism. There were portraits so flat that they gave the impression of insects squashed against the wall. I remember going through, not understanding it one bit. And in the midst of all this fever I came across a little gem, so cool, so finished, so sane, and yet so full of grip, and I stood in front of it until I got better, and then went away. It was a most curious sensation, like a cool hand on a fevered brow. I happen not to have a catalogue, so I have never known the painter. What kind of a picture was it? Asked Clementina. Just a child in a white frock and a blue sash, and not a remarkably pretty child either, but it was a delightful piece of work. Do you remember, she asked, whether there was a mother-of-pearl box on a little table to the left of the girl? Yes, said Quixtus, there was. Do you know the picture? Clementina smiled. She smiled so that her white, strong teeth became visible. Quixtus had never seen Clementina's teeth. Painted it, said Clementina, throwing forward both her hands in triumph. One of her hands met the long glass of coffee and sent it scudding across the table. Quixtus instinctively jerked his chair backward, but he could not escape a great splash of coffee over his waistcoat. Full of delight, gratitude, and dismay, Clementina whipped up her white cotton gloves, and before waiters with napkins could intervene, she wiped him comparatively dry. "Your gloves, your gloves!" he cried, protesting. She held up the unspeakable things and almost laughed as she threw them on the pavement, whence they were picked up carefully by a passing urchin, for nothing is wasted in France. "I would wipe you clean with with anything I've got, in return for you having remembered my picture." "Well," said he, "the compliment, being quite unconscious, was all the more sincere." The waiter mopped up the flooded table. "Let us be depraved," said Clementina in high good humour, "and have some green chartreuse." "Willingly," smiled Quixtus. So they were depraved. And when Clementina went to bed, she wondered why she had railed at Quixtus all these years. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Glory of Clementina Wing by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 19. Clementina went to bed a happier woman than she had been for many a day. Distrusting the ministrations of the Chinese nurse, she had set up a little bed for Sheila in her own room. The child lay there fast asleep, the faithful Pinky projecting from a folded arm in a staring and uncomfortable attitude of vigilance. Clementina's heart throbbed as she bent over her. All that she had struggled for and had attained, mastery of her art, fame, and fortune, shrank to triviality in comparison with this glorious gift of heaven. She remembered scornful words she had once spoken to Tommy. Woman has always her sex hanging round the neck of her spirit. She recognized the truth of the saying, and thanked God for it. She undressed very quietly and walked about the room in stocking feet, feeling a strange sacredness in the presence of the sleeping child. She was happier, too, in that she had forgiven Quixtus. For the first time since she had known him, she felt a curiosity regarding him, a desire for his friendship. Scarcely formulated, arose a determination to bring something vital into his life. As the notable housewife entering a forlorn man's neglected house longs to throw open windows, shake carpets, sweep down cobwebs, abolish dingy curtains, and fill the place with sunlight and chintz and other gaiety, so did Clementina long to sweep and garnish Quixtus's dusty heart. He had many human possibilities. After all, there must be something sound in a man who had treasured in his mind the memory of her picture. Sheila and herself between them would transform him into a gaunt angel. She fell asleep, smiling at the thought. Clementina did not suffer fools gladly. That was why, thinking Quixtus a fool, she had not been able to abide him for so many years. And that was why she could not abide the fat Chinese nurse, who showed herself to be a mass of smiling incompetence. "The way she washes the child makes me sick," she declared. "If I see much more of her heathen idol's grin, I shall go mad and bite her." So the next day, Clementina, with Quixtus as a decorative adjunct, hunted up consular and other authorities, and made with them the necessary arrangements for shipping her off to Shanghai, for which she secretly pined, by the next outward-bound steamer. When they got to London, she would provide the child with a proper Christian nurse, who would bring her up in the fear of the Lord and in habits of tidiness, and in the meanwhile she herself would assume the responsibility of Sheila's physical well-being. "I'm not going to have a flighty young girl," she remarked. "I could tackle her, but you couldn't." "Why should I attempt to tackle her?" asked Quixtus. "You'll be responsible for the child when she stays in Russell Square." "Russell Square?" he echoed. "Yes. She will live partly with you and partly with me, 3 months with each of us alternately. Where did you expect the child to live?" "Upon my soul," said he, "I haven't considered the matter. Well. He walked about the vestibule, revolving this new and alarming proposition. To have a little girl of 5 planted in his dismal, decorous house, what in the world should he do with her? It would revolutionize his habits. Clementina watched him out of a corner of her eye. "You didn't suppose I was going to have all the worry, did you?" No, he said hastily. "Of course not. I see I must share all responsibilities with you. Only, won't you find it living with me rather dull?" "You can keep a lot of cats and dogs and rocking horses and give children's parties," said Clementina. Sheila, who had been apparently absorbed in the mysteries of the Parisian toilet of a flaxen-haired doll, which Clementina had bought for her at an extravagant price, cheerfully lifted up her face. "Auntie says that when I come to stay with you, I'm to be mistress of the house." "Indeed," said Quixtus. "And I'm to be a real lady, and sit at the end of the table and entertain the guests." "I suppose that settles it," he said with a smile. "Of course it does," said Clementina, and she wondered whether his masculine mind would ever be in a condition to grasp the extent of the sacrifice she was making. That day the remains of Will Hamsley were laid to rest in the little Protestant cemetery. The consular chaplain read the service. Only the 2 elders stood by the graveside, thinking the ordeal too harrowing for the child. Clementina wept, for some of her wasted youth lay in the coffin. But Quixtus stood with dry eyes and set features. Now he was sane. Now he could view life calmly. He knew that his memory of the dead would always be bitter. Reason could not sweeten it. It were better to forget. Let the dead past bury its dead. The dead man's child he would take to his heart for her own helpless, sweet sake. Should she, in years to come, turn round and repay him with treachery and ingratitude, it would be but the way of all flesh. In the meanwhile he would be loyal to his word. After the service came to a close, he stood for a few moments gazing into the grave. Clementina edged close to him and pointed down to the coffin. "He may have wronged you, but he trusted you," she said in a low voice. "That's true," said Quixtus. And as they drove back in silence, he murmured once or twice to himself, half audibly, "He wronged me, but he trusted me." That evening they started for Paris. Undesirous of demonstrative welcome at 8:30 in the morning, Clementina had not informed Tommy and Etta of the time of her arrival, and Quicksters had not indulged in superfluous correspondence with Huckabee. The odd trio, now so closely related, stood lonely at the exit of the Lyons station, while porters deposited their luggage in cabs. Each of the elders felt a curious reluctance to part, even for a few hours, for they had agreed to lunch together. Sheila shed a surprised tear. She had adjusted her small mind to the entrance of her Uncle Ephraim into her life. The sudden exit startled her. On his promising to see her very soon, she put her arms prettily round his neck and kissed him. He drove off, feeling the flower-like pressure of the child's lips to his, and it was very sweet. It helped him to take up the threads of Paris where he had left them, a difficult task. Deep shame smote him. What could be henceforward his relations with Huckabee, whom, with crazy malevolent intent, he promised to maintain in the path of clean living? With what self-respect could he look into the eyes of Mrs. Fontaine, innocent and irreproachable woman, whose friendship he had cultivated with such dastardly design? She had placed herself so frankly, so unsuspectingly in his hands. To him, now, it was as unimaginable to betray her trust as to betray that of the child whose kiss lingered on his lips. If ever a woman deserved compensation, full and plenteous, at the hands of man, that was the woman. An insult unrealized is none the less an insult, and he, Quicksters, had insulted a woman. If only to cleanse his own honour from the stain, he must make compensation to this sweet lady. But how? By faithful and loyal service. When he solemnly reached this decision, I think that more than one angel wept, and at the same time wanted to shake him. And behind these two whom he would meet in Paris loomed the forbidding faces of Billiter and Vandermeer. He shivered as at contact with something unclean. He had chosen these men as ministers of evil. He had taken them into his crazy confidence. With their tongues in their cheeks, these rogues had exploited him. He remembered loathsome scenarios of evil dramas they had submitted. Thank heaven for the pedantic fastidiousness that had rejected them. Billiter, Vandermeer, Huckabee, the only three of all men living who knew the miserable secret of his recent life. In a rocky wilderness he could have raced with wild gestures like the leper, shouting, "Unclean! Unclean!" But Paris is not a rocky wilderness, and the semi-extinct quadruped in the shafts of the modern Paris fiacre conveys no idea of racing. Yet, while his soul cried this word of horror, the child's kiss lingered as a sign and a consecration. The first thing to do was to set himself right with Huckabee. Companionship with the man on the recent basis was impossible. He made known his arrival, and an hour afterwards, having bathed and breakfasted, he sat with Huckabee in the pleasant courtyard of the hotel. Huckabee, neat and trim and clear-eyed, clad in well-fitting blue serge, gave him the news of the party. Mrs. Fontaine had introduced him to some charming French people whose hospitality he had ventured to accept. She was well, and full of plans for little festas for the remainder of their stay in Paris. Lady Louisa had found a cavalier, an elderly French marquis of deep gastronomic knowledge. "Lady Louisa," said he, with a sigh of relief and a sly glance at Quicksters, "is a charming lady, but not a highly intellectual companion." "Do you really crave highly intellectual companions, Huckabee?" asked Quicksters. Huckabee bit his lip. "Do you remember our last conversation?" he said at last. "I remember," said Quicksters. "I asked you for a chance. You promised. I was in earnest." "I wasn't," said Quicksters. Huckabee started and gripped the arm of his chair. He was about to protest when Quicksters checked him. "I want you to know," said he, "that great changes have taken place since then. I left Paris in ill health. I return sound. I should like you to grasp the deep significance underlying those few words. I will repeat them." He did so. Huckabee looked hard at his patron, who stood the scrutiny with a grave smile. "I think I understand," he replied slowly. "Then Billiter and Vandermeer?" "Billiter and Vandermeer I put out of my life for ever, but I shall see that they are kept from want." "They can't be kept from wanting more than you give them," said Huckabee, whose brain worked swiftly and foresaw blackmail. "You must impose conditions." "I never thought of that," said Quicksters. "Set a thief to catch a thief," said the other bitterly, I'm telling you for your own good. If they attempt to write to me or see me, their allowances will cease." He covered his eyes with his hand as though to shut out their hateful faces. There was a short silence. Huckabee's lips grew dry. He moistened them with his tongue. "And what about me?" he asked at last. Quixtus drew away his hand with a despairing gesture, but made no reply. "I suppose you're right in classing me with the others," said Huckabee. "Heaven knows I oughtn't to judge them. I was in with them all the time." Quixtus winced. "But I can't go back to them." "My treating you just the same as them won't necessitate your going back to them." Huckabee bent forward, quivering in his chair. "As a God in heaven, Quixtus, I wouldn't accept a penny from you on those terms." "And why not?" "Because I don't want your money. I want to be put in a position to earn some honourably for myself. I want your help as a man, your sympathy as a human being. I want you to help me to live a clean, straight life. I kept the promise, the important promise I made you, ever since we started. You can't say I haven't. And since you left, I've not touched a drop of alcohol. And if you promise to help me, I swear to God I never will, as long as I live. What can I do, man?" he cried, throwing out his arms, "to prove to you that I'm in deadly earnest?" Quixtus lay back in his chair, reflecting, his fingertips joined together. Presently a smile, half humorous, half kindly, lit up his features, a smile such as Huckabee had not seen since before the days of the hostless dinner of disaster, and it was manifest to Huckabee that some at least of the Quixtus of old had come back to earth. "In the last day or two," said Quixtus, "I formed a staunch friendship with one who was a crabbed and inveterate enemy. It is Miss Clementina Wing, the painter, whom you saw in somewhat painful circumstances the other day at the tea-room. I will give you an opportunity, I hope many, of meeting her again. I don't want to hurt your feelings, my dear Huckabee, but so many strange things have happened of late that I, for the present, mistrust my own judgment. I hope you understand." "Not quite. You don't mean to tell—" Quixtus flushed and drew himself up. "After 20 years, do you know me so little as that?" "I beg your pardon," said the other humbly. Again Quixtus smiled at a reminiscent phrase of Clementina's. "At any rate, my dear fellow," said he, "even if she doesn't approve of you, she will do you a thundering lot of good." At the smile Huckabee took heart of grace, but at the same time the memory of Clementina, storming over the tea-table for all the world like a French revolutionary general, filled his soul with wholesome dismay. Well, there was no help for it. He must take his chance. So he filled a philosophic pipe. A little later Quixtus met the spotless flower of womanhood whom he had so grievously insulted. She greeted him with both hands outstretched. Without him Paris had been a desert. Why had he not sent her the smallest, tiniest line of news? Ah, she understood. It had been a sojourn of pain. Never mind. Paris, she hoped, would prove to be an anodyne. Only if she would administer it in the right doses, said Quixtus gallantly. Dressed with exquisite demureness, she found favour in his sight. He realized with a throb of thanksgiving that henceforward he could meet her on equal terms, as an honourable gentleman, no grotesque devilry haunting the back of his mind and clouding the serenity of their intercourse. "Tell me what you've been doing with yourself," she said, drawing him to a seat. The little air of intimacy and ownership so delicately assumed captivated the remorseful man. He had not realized the charm that awaited him in Paris. He touched lightly on Marseille happenings, spoke of his guardianship, of Sheila, of her clinging feminine ways, drew a smiling picture of his terror when Clementina had first left him alone with the child. Mrs. Fontaine laughed sympathetically at the tale, and then, with a touch of tenderness in her voice that perhaps was not deliberate, said, "In spite of the worries, you have benefited by the change. You've come back a different man." "In what way?" "I can't define it."
"Try."
A quick glance met earnest questioning in his eyes. She looked down and daintily plucked at the sunshade across her lap. "I should say you had come back more human." Quixtus's eyelids flickered. Clementina had used the same word. Was there then an obvious transformation from Quixtus Furens to Quixtus Sane? He remembered the child's kiss. "Perhaps it's my new responsibilities," he said with a smile. "I should so much like to see her. I wonder if I ever shall," said Mrs. Fontaine. "She's coming here to lunch with Miss Wing," replied Quicksters, eager now that his good friends should know and appreciate each other. "Won't Lady Louisa and yourself join us?" "Delighted," said Mrs. Fontaine. "Miss Clementina Wing is quite a character. I should like to see more of her." Quicksters, his mind full of sweet atonement, did not detect any trace of acidity in her words. On the stroke of 1, the time appointed for luncheon, Clementina and Sheila appeared at the end of the long lounge, Tommy and Etta straggling in their wake. Quicksters rose from the table where his 3 friends were seated and advanced to meet them. Sheila ran forward, and he took her in his arms and kissed her. "You didn't ask these children to lunch, but I brought them." "They're very welcome," said Quicksters, smiling. Tommy, his fair face aflame with joy, wrung his hand. "I told you I would look you up in the Hotel Continental. By Jove, I am glad to see you. I've been an awful ass, you know. Of course I thought—" "Hush, hush," said Quicksters. "My dear Mr. Concan, I'm delighted to see you." "She goes by the name of Etta," said Tommy proudly. Clementina jerked her thumb towards them. "Engaged, young idiots." "My dear Miss Etta," said Quicksters, taking the hand of the furiously blushing girl, "my friend Tommy is an uncommonly lucky fellow." He nodded at Sheila, who hung on to his fingertips. "Have you made friends with this young lady?" "She's a darling," cried Etta. "Clementina," said Tommy, "you're a wretch. You shouldn't have given us away." "You gave yourselves away, you silly geese. People have been grinning at you all the time you were walking here." Then her glance fell upon the expectant trio a little way off. "Oh, Lord," she said, "those people again." "They're my very good friends," said Quicksters, "and I want you to meet them again in normal circumstances. I want you to like them." He looked at her in mild appeal. Clementina's lips twisted into a wry smile. "All right," she said. "Don't worry, I'll be civil." So it came to pass that the 2 women again faced each other. Mrs. Fontaine, all daintiness and fragrance, in her simple but exquisitely cut fawn costume, the chaste contours of her face set off by an equally simple 10-guinea black hat with an ostrich feather. Clementina, rugged, powerful, untidy in her ill-fitting mustardy brown stuff skirt and jacket, and heavy business-like shoes, and again between the 2 pairs of eyes was the flicker of rapiers. And as soon as they were disengaged, and Clementina turned to Lady Louisa, she felt the other's swift glance travel from the soles of her feet to the rickety old rose in her hat. There are moments when sex gives a woman eyes in the back of her head. She turned round quickly and surprised the most elusive ghost of a smile imaginable. For the first time in her life Clementina felt herself at a disadvantage. She winced, then mentally, so as to speak, snapped her fingers. What had she to do with the woman, or the woman with her? All the presentations having been made, Quicksters led the way to the restaurant of the hotel. "Clementina," said he, "may I ask you to concede the place of honour for this occasion to my unexpected but most charming and most welcome guest?" He indicated Etta, still blushing, into whose ears Tommy whispered that his uncle always spoke like a penny book with the covers off. "My dear man," said Clementina, "stick me anywhere, so long as it's next the baby, and I can see that nobody feeds her on anchovies and lobster salad." She understood perfectly. The second seat of honour was Mrs. Fontaine's. She confounded Mrs. Fontaine, but what was Mrs. Fontaine to her, or she to Mrs. Fontaine? They took their places at the round table laid for 8. On Quickster's right, Etta; on his left, Mrs. Fontaine. Then Sheila, somewhat awed at the grown-up luncheon party, and squeezing Pinky very tight so as to give her courage. Then Clementina, with Huckabee as left-hand neighbour. Then Lady Louisa, and Tommy next to Etta. Clementina kept her word, and behaved with great civility. Tommy politely addressed Lady Louisa, to the immense relief of Huckabee, who, thus temporarily freed from his Martha, plunged into eager conversation with Clementina about her picture in the salon, which had attracted considerable attention. He did not tell her that, in order to refresh his memory of the masterpiece, he had revisited the Grand Palais that morning. He praised the technique. There was to it that hint of Velasquez which so many portrait painters tried for, and so few got. This pleased Clementina. Velasquez was the god of her art. One bright spot in her dreary youth was her life with Velasquez in Madrid. "I, too, once tried to know something about him," said Huckabee. "I wrote a monograph, a wretched compilation only, in a series of lives of great painters for a firm of publishers." Hard work or not, the authorship of a life of Velasquez was enough to prejudice her in Huckabee's favour. She learned, too, that he was a sometime Fellow of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and a university contemporary of Quickstus. Huckabee, finding her not the rough-tongued virago from whom Quickstus had always shrunk, and of whom, at their one meeting in the tea-room, he himself had not received the suavest impression, but a frank, intelligent woman, gradually forgot his anxiety to please, and talked naturally, as became a man of his scholarship. The result was that Clementina thought him a pleasant and sensible fellow, an opinion which she expressed later in the day to Quickstus. With regard to Mrs. Fontaine, her promise of ladylike behaviour was harder to keep. All through the meal her dislike grew stronger. That Quickstus should bend towards Etta in his courtly fashion, and pay her little gallant attentions, was but natural. Indeed, it was charming courtesy towards Tommy's betrothed. But that he should do the same to Mrs. Fontaine, and add to it a subtle shade of intimacy, was exasperating. In the lady's attitude, too, towards Quickstus, Clementina perceived an air of proprietorship, a triumphant consciousness of her powers of fascination. When Quickstus addressed a remark across the table to Clementina, Mrs. Fontaine adroitly drew his attention to herself. Her manner gave Clementina to understand that, although a frump of a portrait painter might be an important person in her studio, yet in the big world outside the attractive woman had victorious preeminence. Now Clementina was a woman, and one whose nature had lately gone through unusual convulsions. She found it difficult to be polite to Mrs. Fontaine. Only once was there a tiny eruption of the volcano. Sheila's seat at the table being too low for her small body, Clementina demanded a cushion from the maitre d'hôtel. When, after some delay, a waiter brought it, she was engaged in talk with Huckabee. She turned in time to see Mrs. Fontaine about to lift Sheila from her seat. With a sudden rough movement she all but snatched the child out of the other's arms, and herself sought to Sheila's sedentary comfort. She didn't care what Quickstus or anyone else thought of her. She was not going to have this alien woman touch her child. The hussy flirtation with Quickstus she could not prevent, but no woman born of woman should come between her and the beloved child of her adoption. The incident passed almost unnoticed. The meal ended pleasantly. With the exception of the two women in their mutual attitude, everybody was surprisedly delighted with everybody else. Etta thought Quickstus the very dearest thing, next to Admiral Concannon, that had ever a bald spot on the top of his head. Clementina, in a fit of graciousness, gave Huckabee the precious freedom of her studio. He could come and look at her pictures whenever he liked. Sheila, made much of, went away duly impressed with her new friends. Quickstus rubbed his hands at the success of his party. The apparently irreconcilable were reconciled, difficulties were vanishing rapidly, his path stretched out before him in rosy smoothness. But Tommy's quick eyes had noticed the snatching of Sheila. "Etta," said he, "I've known Clementina intimately all these years, and I find I know nothing at all about her." "What do you mean?" asked the girl. "For the first time in my life," said he, "I've just discovered that the dear old thing is as jealous as a cat." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Glory of Clementina Wing by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 20. "My good children, I tell you we'll go by train," said Clementina, putting her foot down. "I don't care a brass button for the chauffeur's loneliness, and the prospect of his pining away on his journey back to London leaves me cold." She had exhausted the delights of the car of 35 million dove power, and was anxious to settle Sheila in Romney Place as quickly as possible. "As for you two," she added, "you've had as big a dose of each other as is good for you." Only one thing tempted her to linger in Paris: curiosity as to the sentimental degree of the friendship between the lady of her disfavour and Quickstus. That she was a new friend and not an old friend the exchange of a few remarks with the ingenuous Lady Louisa had enabled her very soon to discover. Clementina looked askance on such violent intimacies. Quixtus, for whose welfare now she felt herself in an absurd way responsible, had not the constitution to stand them. The lady might be highly connected and move in the selectest of circles, but she had a hard edge, betraying what Clementina was pleased to call the society hack. She was shallow, insincere, talked out of a hastily stuffed memory instead of an intellect. She had the vulgarity of good breeding, as noticeable a quality as the good breeding of one in lowly station. She was insufferable, an impossible companion for a man of Quixtus's mental equipment and sensitive organization. There was something else about her that baffled Clementina and further whetted her curiosity. Neither was Clementina perfect, nor did she look for perfection in this compromise of a world. As an artist, she demanded light and shade. "I wouldn't paint an angel's portrait," she said once, "for £50,000, and if an angel came to tea with me, the first thing I should do would be to claw off his wings." Now no one could deny the light and shade in Lina Fontaine, but there is such a thing as false chiaroscuro, and it offends and perplexes the artist. Lina Fontaine offended and perplexed Clementina. Again, Clementina, with regard to the chambers of her heart, was somewhat house-proud. Very few were admitted, but once admitted, the favoured mortal was welcome to stay there for ever. Now, behold an exasperating aggravation. She had just received Quixtus in the very best guest-room, and, instead of admiring it and taking his ease in it, here he was hanging half-way out of the window, all ears to a common hussy. If she had an insane desire to pull him back by the coat-tails, who can blame her? No sensible purpose being attainable, however, by lingering in Paris, she gruffly sent temptation packing, and with her brood under her wing, took the noon train from the Gare du Nord on the following day. Quixtus was there at the station to see them off, his arms filled with packages. As he could not raise his hat when the party approached, he smiled apologetically, looking, according to Tommy, like Father Christmas detected at midsummer. There was a great bouquet of orchids for Clementina, such a handy useful thing on the journey from Paris to London, an enormous bonbonnière of sweets for Etta, a stupendous woolly lamb for Sheila, which, on something being done to its anatomy, opened its mouth and gramophonically chanted the Jewel song from Faust, and a gold watch for Tommy. The singing of the lamb, incautiously exploited on the platform to Sheila's ecstasy, caused considerable dislocation of railway business. A crowd collected to see the gaunt, scholarly Englishman holding the apocalyptic beast in his arms, all intent on the rapture of the tiny flower-like thing standing open-mouthed before him. Even porters forgot to say "Faites attention," and stopped their barrows to listen to the magic song and view the unprecedented spectacle. It was only when the lamb bleated his last note that Quixtus became conscious of his surroundings. "Good heavens!" said he. "Do it again," said Sheila in her clear contralto, whereat the bystanders laughed. "Not for anything in the world, my dear. Tommy, take the infernal thing." "My dear," said he, lifting Sheila in his arms, "if I know anything of Tommy, he will have that tune going for the next 7 hours." She allowed herself to be carried in seraphic content to the entrance of the car in which was the compartment reserved for the party. Tommy, carrying the lamb, Clementina and Etta followed. "That kid's a wonder," said Tommy. "She would creep into the heart of a parsnip." Clementina, to whom the remark was addressed, walked 3 or 4 steps in silence. Then she said, "Tommy, if I hear you say a thing like that again, I'll box your ears." He stared at her in amazement. He paid a spontaneous and sincere tribute to the child over whom she had gone crazy. What more could she want? She moved a step in advance, leaving him free to justify himself with Etta, who agreed with him in the proposition that Clementina for the last 2 days was in a very cranky mood. Very natural, the proposition of the 2 innocents. How could they divine that the moisture in Clementina's eyes had nothing whatsoever to do with Sheila's appreciation of the vocal lamb, or her readiness to be carried by Quixtus? How could they divine that, at the possibility of which the cruelty and insolence of youth would have caused them both to shriek with inextinguishable laughter? And how was Tommy, generous-hearted lad that he was, to know that this one unperceptive speech of his sent him hurtling out of the land of romance down to common earth? Henceforward, Tommy, whilst retaining his chamber in Clementina's heart, was to walk in and out just as he chose. Not the tiniest pang was he again to cause her. What could Tommy know, What can you or I or any other male thing ever born know of a woman? We walk, good, easy men, with confident and careless tread through the familiar garden, and then suddenly terra firma miraculously ceases to exist, and head over heels we go down a precipice. How came it that we were unaware of its existence? Mystère! Who could interpret the soul of La Gioconda? Leonardo da Vinci least of all. It is all very well to give a man a vote. He is a transparent animal, and you know the way the dunderhead is going to use it. But the incalculable and pyrotechnic way in which women will use it will make humanity blink. Let us therefore pardon Tommy for staring in amazement at Clementina. He sought refuge in Etta. From Scylla perhaps to Charybdis, but for the present Charybdis sat smiling under her fig tree, the most innocent and bewitching monster in the world. Leaving the 3 children in the compartment, Clementina and Quickstus walked, for the last few moments before the train started, up and down the platform. "I suppose you'll soon be coming back to London?" said Clementina. "I think so," said he. "Now that the Grand Prix is over, Paris is emptying rapidly." "Parrot," thought Clementina, once more confounding the instructress. But she said blandly, "What difference in the world can it make to you whether Paris is empty or not?" He smiled good-naturedly. "To tell the honest truth, none. Yes, I must be getting home again." "Of course there'll be a certain amount of worry over Hammersley's affairs," she said, "but I hope you've got something else to do to occupy your mind." "I want to settle down to systematic work," replied Quickstus. "What kind of work?" "Well," said he, with an apologetic air, "I mean to extend my little handbook on the household arts of the Neolithic age into an authoritative and comprehensive treatise. I've been gathering material for years. I'm anxious to begin." "Begin tomorrow," said Clementina, "and whenever you feel lonely, come and read bits of it to Sheila and me." And thus came about the surprising and monstrous alliance between Clementina and prehistoric man. Dead men's jawbones had some use after all. "En voiture!" cried the guard. "Goodbye, my dear Clementina," said Quickstus. "We've had a memorable meeting." "We have indeed. You are sending away 3 very happy people." "Why not 4? But she only smiled wryly and said, "Goodbye, God bless you, and keep out of mischief," and clambered into the train. The train began to move, to the faint strains of the Jewel song in Faust, and Sheila blew him kisses from the carriage window. He responded until the little white face disappeared. Then he thought of Clementina. "The very best, but the most enigmatic woman in the world," said he, which was a very sweeping statement for a man of his scientific accuracy. Entirely ignorant of the word of the enigma, he went back to the spotless flower of insulted womanhood, who took him off to lunch with her French friends. She welcomed his undivided homage. That fish-fag of a creature, as she characterized Clementina in conversation with Lady Louisa, made her feel uncomfortable. Even now that she had gone, the problem of Quickstus's removal from her sphere of influence remained. The child was the stake to which he was fettered within that sphere. Could she break the chains? Therein seemed to lie the only solution, unless by audacity and adroitness she uprooted the stake and carried it, with Quickstus, chains and all, into her own territory. She had a talk after lunch with Huckabee. The luncheon party had broken up into groups of 2 or 3, who wandered about the cool enclosure of the Bois de Boulogne restaurant where the feast had been given, and half by chance, half by design, the 2 had joined company. Their conversation on the evening of Quickstus's departure from Paris had deeply affected their mutual relations. Each felt conscious of presenting a less tarnished front to the other, and each, not hypocritically, began to assume a little halo of virtue in the pathetic hope that the other would be impressed by its growing radiance. During the few days of Quickstus's absence they had become friends and exchanged confidences. Huckabee convinced her of the sincerity of his desire to reform. He described his life. He had worked when work came his way, but work has a curious habit of shrinking from the drunkard's way. A bit of teaching, a bit of freelance journalism, a bit of hack compilation in the British Museum. He had borrowed far and wide. He had not been over-scrupulous on the point of financial honour. Hunger had driven him. Lena Fontaine shivered at the horrors through which he had struggled. All he desired was cleanliness in life and body and surroundings. She understood. Material cleanliness had been and would be hers, but cleanliness of life she yearned for as much as he did. But for him, the man, with the given boon of honourable employment, it was an easy matter. For her, the woman, tired and soul-sick, what avenue lay open? She, in her turn, told him of incidents in her career, at which he shuddered. "Throw it up," he counselled. She smiled bitterly. What could be the end of the bird of prey who assumed the habits of the dove? She could marry, he replied, before it was too late. Marry? Aye, but whom? She had not dared confide to him her hope. So close, however, being their relations, Huckabee had not failed to acquaint her with the important scope of his conversation with Quickstus the day before. Quickstus's changed demeanour, obvious to her at once, confirmed his announcement. She welcomed it with more joy than Huckabee could appreciate, for behind the pity that had paralysed beak and talon, the newborn hope and the curious liking she conceived for the mild, crazy gentleman stalked the instinctive aversion which the sane feel towards those whose wits have gone ever so little astray. The news had come as an immense relief. Now she could meet him on normal ground. All was fair. They found 2 chairs by a little table under a tree at the back of the chalet restaurant, and secluded from the gaiety and laughter of the front. Nothing human was in sight, save, through the tall, masking acacias and shrubs, the white gleams of cooks and hurrying aproned waiters. "Let us sit," she said. "How good it is to get a little cool and quiet. This vie de cabaret is getting on my nerves. I'm weary to death of it." Huckabee laughed. "It's still enough novelty to me to be pleasant." She accepted a cigarette. They smoked for a while. "How's goodness getting on?" she asked. "And by leaps and bounds daily. I'm becoming a fanatical believer in the copybook. I'm virtuous. I'm happy. Industry is a virtue. My virtue is to be rewarded by industry. Therefore virtue is its own reward." "What industry?" "I'm going to collaborate with our friend in the new book he's talking about," replied Huckabee with a surviving touch of boastfulness. "There is also a possibility of my taking over the secretaryship of the Anthropological Society." "You're lucky," said Lena Fontaine. "How's goodness with you?" "Oh, the usual slump. Shares going dirt cheap. No one seems to have any use for virtue in a woman." "Husbands seem to have, as I've already suggested to you." "Have you any particular husband to suggest?" He cast on her a glance of admiration, for in her outward seeming she was an object for any man's forgivable desire, and he said, in a tone of not wholly of banter, "The humble individual in front of you would have no chance, I suppose?" She laughed. "None whatever." "You'll pardon my presumption in making the offer, but could I, en galant homme, do otherwise?" "No," she replied good-humouredly, "you couldn't. If you had 5,000 a year it would give me to think, for you're not unsympathetic. But as you haven't, I've no use for you. As a husband, bien entendu." It was a jest. They laughed. Presently a cloud obscured the sunshine of her laughter. She leaned over the table. "Eustace Huckabee, are you or are you not my friend?" For once, in her dealings with a man whose goodwill she desperately craved, she was sincere. She dropped the conscious play of glance and tone, but she forgot the liquid splendour of her eyes and the dangerous nearness of her face to his. "Your friend?" he cried, laying his hand on her wrist. "Can you doubt it? I am indeed. I swear it." "Do you know why I'm staying here, apparently wasting my time?" "I suppose something was up, but my self-position seemed too absurd." "Why absurd?" "Quickstus as a husband." "Yes, why not?" He released her wrist and fell back in his chair. He frowned and tugged at his beard. "Do you care for him?" "Yes, in a way, I sincerely do. If you mean have I fallen desperately in love with him, well, I haven't. That would be absurd. It's not my habit to fall in love." "What would you get out of it?" She made an impatient gesture. "Rest, peace, happiness. He's a wealthy man and would give me all the comfort I need. I couldn't face poverty. And he would be kind to me." "And he—pardon the brutality of my question— What would he get out of it? "I'm a lady, after all," she said, "and I know how to run a large house. And as a woman I'm not unattractive. And I'd run straight. Temperamentally I am straight. That's frank. Whatever impulses I've had within me with regard to running off the rails have been the other way. Oh, God, yes," she added with a little shiver and averted eyes. "I'd run straight." "What about ghosts of the past rising up and queering things?" "I'd take my chance. I've bluffed myself out of tight places already, and I could bluff again." Huckabee lit another cigarette. "He looks on you as a spotless angel of purity," said he. "If he married you on that assumption and learned things afterwards, there would be the devil to pay. He's been hit like that already, and he went off his head. I shouldn't like him to have another experience. Why not tell him something, just a little?" She raised both hands in nervous protest. "Oh, no, no. The woman who does that is a fool. It never comes off. Let him take me for what he thinks I am, and I'll see that I remain so. Trust me, it'll be all right. You're the only impediment." "I?" "Of course. You have it in your power to give me away at any time. That's why I ask you whether you were my friend." Huckabee tugged at his beard and pondered deeply. He meant, with all the fresh energy of new resolve, to be loyal to Quickstus. But how could he stand in the way of a woman seeking salvation? Moral sense, however, is a plant of gradual growth. Huckabee's as yet was not adequate to the solution of the perplexing problem. Lena Fontaine held out her hand, palm upward, across the table. "Speak," she said. He took her hand and pressed it. "I'll be your friend in this," said he. She thanked him with her eyes and rose. "Let us go back to the others, or they'll think we're having a horrible flirtation." On this, and on the succeeding days, she discovered a subtle change in Quickstus's attitude towards her. His manner had grown, if possible, more courteous. It betrayed a more delicate admiration, a more graceful homage to the beautiful and charming woman. Before his Marseilles visit she had found it an easy task to appeal to the fool that grins in every man. A trick of eyes and voice was enough to set him love-making in what she had termed the Quickstein manner. Now the task was more difficult. She found herself confronted by a greater sensitiveness that did not respond to the obvious invitation. He was up in the clouds, more chivalrous, more idealistic. With a sigh she gathered her skirts together and climbed to the higher plane. And all this on Quickstus's part was sheer remorse, atonement for the unspeakable insult. The thought of having dared to make coarse love to this exquisite creature filled him with horrified dismay. That the ladies appeared rather to like the coarse love-making he did not stop to consider. Certainly in his crazy exultation he had proclaimed her a fruit ripe to his hand, but that was only an additional vulgarity which had stained that peculiar phase of his being. The result of the reaction was to accentuate the reverential conception of woman which, by reason of a temperament dreamy and poetic, and of a scholarly life remote from the disillusioning conflicts of sex, he had always entertained. He comported himself therefore towards her with scrupulous delicacy, resolved that not a word or intonation that could be construed into an affront should ever pass his lips. The fine weather broke. Torrential rains swept Paris. The meteorologists talked learnedly about cyclonic disturbances in the Atlantic which would affect the weather adversely for some time to come. Lena Fontaine began to reflect. Summer Paris in rain is no place for junketing, even on the high plains. It offers to the visitor nothing but the boredom of hotel and restaurant. She knew the elementary axiom of sex relations, that the woman who bores a man is lost. The high plains were all right when you looked down from them on charming, objective things, but after all a man has to be amused, and fun on the high plains is a humour dangerously attenuated. She announced an immediate departure from Paris. "If you would accept the escort of Huckabee and myself, we should be honoured," said Quickstus, "unless, of course, we should be in the way." She laughed. "My dear friend, did you ever hear of men being in the way when women were travelling? A lone woman is never more conspicuously lonesome than en voyage. All the other women around who have men to look after them look at one with a kind of patronizing pity, as though they said, "Poor thing that can't rake up a man from anywhere." And it makes one want to scratch.
"Does it really?" smiled Quicksters.
"It does." She laughed again and sighed. "A lone woman has much to put up with. Malicious tongues not the least."
"My dear Mrs. Fontaine," said he, "what tongue could be so malicious as to speak evil of you?"
"There are thousands in this gossipy world. Our little friendship and camaraderie of the last fortnight, sweetness and innocence itself, who knows what misinterpretation slanderers might put on it?" Quicksters flushed and drew his gaunt body to its full height.
"I am not pugilistic by habit," said he, "but if any man made such an insinuation I should knock him down."
"It would be more likely a woman."
"Then," said he, "I think I could manage to convey to her, without brutality, that she was a disgrace to her sex."
She fluttered a glance at him. "I should like to have you always as a champion."
"If I understand the word gentleman aright," said Quicksters, "he is always the champion of the unprotected woman."
His tone assured her that this early Victorian sentiment was not mere gallantry. He meant it, indignant still at the idea of misconstruction of their friendship. "I happen to be a woman," she said, "and seek the particular rather than the general. I said my champion, Dr. Quicksters. Now don't say that the greater includes the less, or I shall fall through the floor." He was too much in earnest to smile with her in her coquetry.
"Mrs. Fontaine," said he, with a bow, "no one will ever dare speak evil of you in my presence."
She rose. They were sitting in the lounge. "Thank you," she said, falling in with his earnest mood. "Thank you. I shall go back to London with a light heart." And like a wise woman, she cut short the conversation and went upstairs to dress for dinner. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Glory of Clementina Wing by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 21. July brought in halcyon days for everybody. They were halcyon days for Clementina. There were neglected portraits to complete, new sitters for whom to squeeze in appointments, a host of stimulating things, not the least of which was the beloved atmosphere, half turpentine, half poetry, of the studio. Only the painter can know the delight of the mere feel of the long-forsaken brush and the sight of the blobs of colour oozing out from the tubes onto the palette. Most of us, returning to toil after holiday, sigh over departed joys. To the painter, the joy of getting back to his easel is worth all the joys that have departed. Clementina plunged into work as a long-stranded duck plunges into water. By rising at dawn, a practice contrary to her habit, she managed to keep pace with her work and to attend to the various affairs which her new responsibilities entailed. Her days were filled to overflowing, and filled with extraordinary happiness. A nurse was engaged for Sheila, a kind and buxom widow who also found herself living in halcyon days. She could do practically whatever she liked, as her charge was seldom in her company. The child had her being in the studio, playing happily and quietly in a corner, thus realizing Clementina's dream, or watching her paint with great wondering eyes. The process fascinated her. She would sit for an hour at a time, good as gold, absorbed in the magic of the brush-strokes, clasping the dingy pinky tight against her bosom. Tommy appeared one day with a box of paints, a miniature easel, and a great mass of uncoloured fashion plates of beautiful ladies in gorgeous raiment. A lesson or two inspired Sheila with artistic zeal, so that often a sitter would come upon the two of them, painting breathlessly, Clementina screwing up her eyes, darting backwards and forwards to her canvas, and the dainty child seated on a milking stool and earnestly making animated rainbows of the beautiful ladies in the fashion plates. Then there was the tedious process of obtaining probate of Hammersley's will. Luckily, he had wound up all his affairs in Shanghai, to the common satisfaction of himself and his London house, so that no complications arose from the latter quarter. Indeed, the firm gave the executors its cordial assistance. But the London house had to be interviewed, and lawyers had to be interviewed, and Quicksters and all kinds of other people, and papers had to be read and signed, and affidavits to be made, and head-splitting intricacies of business and investments to be mastered. All this ate up many of the sunny hours. Tommy and Etta had halcyon days of their own, which, but by the free use of curmudgeonly roughness, would have merged into Clementina's. Etta had cajoled an infuriated admiral, raving round the room after a horsewhip, into a stern parent who consented to receive Tommy, explicitly reserving to himself the right to throw him out of the window should the young man not take his fancy. Tommy called, and was allowed to depart peacefully by the front door. Then Quixtus, incited thereto by Tommy, called upon the admiral with the awful solemnity of a father in a French play, with the result that Tommy was invited to dinner at the admiral's, and given as much excellent old port as he could stand. After which the admiral called on Clementina, whom he had not met before. During the throes of horsewhip hunting he had threatened to visit her there and then and give her a piece of his mind, which at that moment was more like a hunk of molten lava than anything else. But the arts and wiles of Etta had prevailed, so that the above-scheduled sequence of events had been observed. Clementina, caught in the middle of a hot afternoon's painting, received him, bedaubed and bedraggled, in the studio, whose chaos happened to be that day more than usually confounded. The admiral, accustomed to the point-device females of his world, and making the spick and span of the quarter-deck a matter of common morality in material surroundings, went from Romney Place an obfuscated man. "I can't make your friend out," he said to Etta. "I don't mind telling you that if I had seen her I should never have allowed you to visit her. I found her looking more like a professional rabbit-skinner than a lady. When I went to sit down I had to clear away a horrid plate of half-finished cold pie, by George, from the chair. She contradicted me flatly in everything I said about you, as if I didn't know my own child, and filled me up with advice." "And wasn't it good, dear?" "No advice is ever good. Like Nebuchadnezzar's food, it may be wholesome, but it isn't good. And then she turned round and talked the most downright common sense about women I've ever heard a woman utter. And then, by Jove, I don't know how it happened. I never talk shop, you know." "Of course you don't, dear. Never," said Etta. "Of course I don't. But somehow we got on to the subject. She showed a more intelligent appreciation of the state of naval affairs than any man I've met for a long time. And as for those superficial, theoretical donkeys at the club—" "And what else, darling?" said Etta, who had often heard about the donkeys, but now was dying to hear about Clementina. "Do tell me what she talked about. She must have talked about me, didn't she?" "About you? I've told you." He took her chin in his hand. She was sitting on a footstool, her arms about his knee. "You can't have told me everything, dear." "I think she informed me that her selection of a husband for you was a damn sight better than mine. I beg your pardon, my dear, I didn't say damned. And then the little girl you've always talking of came in, and the rabbit-skinner seemed to turn into an ordinary sort of woman, took me up, and in a way threw me down on the floor to play with the child." "What did you play at, Dad? When I was little you used to pretend to swallow a fork. Did you swallow a fork?" The iron features relaxed into a smile. "I did, my dear, and it was the cold pie fork wiped on a bit of newspaper. And last of all, what do you think she said?" "No one on earth could guess, dear, what Clementina might have said." "She actually asked me to sit for a crayon sketch, said my face was interesting to her as an artist, and she would like to make a study of it for her own pleasure. Now what pleasure could anybody on earth find in looking at my ugly old mug?" "But, dear, you have a most beautiful mug," cried Etta. "I don't mean beautiful like the photographs of popular actors, but full of strength and character. Just the fine face that appeals to the artist." "Do you think so?" asked the admiral. "I'm sure." She ran to a little table and brought a Florentine mirror. "Look." He looked. Instinctively the man of 65 touched the finely curved grizzled hair about his temples. "You're a silly child," said he. She kissed him. "Now confess, you had the goodness of good times with Clementina this afternoon?" "I don't mind owning," said the admiral, "that I find her a most intelligent woman." And that is the way that all of us sons of Adam, even admirals of the British fleet, can be beguiled by the daughters of Eve. Halcyon days were they for Quixtus, for whom London wore an entirely different aspect from the Akeldama he had left. Instead of its streets and squares stretching out before him as the scene of potential devilry, it smiled upon him as the centre of manifold pleasant interests. He had the great work to attack, the final picture that mortal knowledge could draw of that far-off haunting phase of human life before the startling use of iron was known to mankind. It was not to be a dull catalogue of dead things. The dead things, a million facts, were to be the skeleton on which he would build his great, vivid, flesh-and-blood story, the dream of his life, which only now did he feel the vital impulse to realize. He had his club and his cronies, harmless folk, beneath whose mild exterior he no longer divined horrible corruption. From them all he received congratulations on his altered mien. The change had done him good. He was looking 10 years younger. Some chaffed him after the way of men. Wonderful place, Paris. He found a stimulating interest in his new responsibilities. Vestiges of his perfunctory legal training remained, and enabled him to unravel simple complications in the Hammersley affairs, much to Clementina's admiration and his own satisfaction. He discovered a pleasure once more in the occasional society of Tommy, and concerned himself seriously with his love-making and his painting. He spoke of him to Dawkins, the rich donor of the Anthropological Society portrait, to whom Tommy had alluded with such disrespect to Clementina. Dawkins visited Tommy's studio, and walked away with a couple of pictures, after having paid such a price as to make the young man regard him as a fairy godfather in vast white waistcoat and baggy trousers. Quixus also entertained Tommy and Etta at lunch at the Carlton, Mrs. Fontaine completing the quartet. "I should have liked it better," said Clementina, when she heard of the incident, and she heard all that happened to the lovers. "I should have liked it better if it hadn't brought Mrs. Fontaine into it." Whereat Tommy winked at Etta, unbeknown to Clementina. Quixus's friendship with the spotless flower of womanhood continued. He had tea with her in her prettily furnished little house in Pont Street, where he met several of her acquaintances, people of unquestionable position in the London world, and attended 1 or 2 receptions, and even a dance at which he was present. Very skilfully she drew him into her circle, and adroitly played him in public as a serious aspirant to her spotless hand. There were many who called him the variegated synonyms of a fool, for to hard-bitten worldlings few illusions are left concerning a woman like Lena Fontaine. But they shrugged their shoulders cynically, and viewed the capture with amused interest. Only the most jaded complained. If she wanted to give them a sensation, why did she not go a step further, and lead about a bishop on her string? But these uncharitable remarks did not reach Quixus's ears. The word went round that he was a man of distinguished scientific position. Whether he was a metallurgist or a brain specialist, no one at the tired end of the London season either knew or cared to know. And his courtly and scholarly demeanour confirming the rumour, the corner of Vanity Fair in which Lena Fontaine fought to hold her position paid him considerable deference. The flattery of the frivolous pleased him, as it had pleased many a good, simple man before him. He thought Mrs. Fontaine's friends very charming, though perhaps not over-intellectual people. He went among them, however, scarce knowing why. A card of invitation would come by post from Lady Anything, whom he had once met. Before he had time to obey his first impulse and decline, Lena Fontaine's voice would be heard over the telephone. "Are you going to Lady Anything's on Friday?"
"I don't think so."
"She has asked you, I know. I'm going."
"Oh?"
"Do come. Lady Anything tells me she's got some interesting people to meet you, and I shall be so miserable if you're not there." Who was he to cause misery to the spotless lady? The victim yielded, and blandly unconscious of feminine guile, was paraded before the interesting people as the latest and most lasting conquest of Lena Fontaine's bow and spear. August plans were discussed. She was thinking of Dinah. What was Quixtus proposing to do? He had not considered the question, had contemplated work in London. She held up her hands. London in August? How could he exist in the stuffy place? He needed a real holiday.
"To tell you the truth, I don't know where to go," said he.
Very delicately she suggested Dinah. He objected in his shy way. Dinah was the haunt of fashion and frivolity.
"I should walk about the place like a daw among peacocks," said he.
"But why should you be a daw? Why not do a little peacocking? Colour in life would be good for you, and I would undertake to keep your feathers trim." He smiled, half allured, half repelled by the idea of strutting among such gay birds. To refuse the spotless lady's request downright was an act of discourtesy of which he was incapable. He gave a vague and qualified assent to the proposal, which she did not then tempt him to make more definite. Content with her progress, she bided her time. Quixtus had little leisure to reflect on the sceptical attitude towards humanity which, theoretically, he still maintained. In addition to all these hour-absorbing interests, Sheila began to occupy a considerable place in his life. Sometimes he would call at Romney Place. Sometimes Clementina would bring the child to Russell Square. Sometimes, when Clementina was too busy, Sheila came in the nurse's charge. He cleared out a large room at the top of the house, which was to be Sheila's nursery when she took up her quarters there. It needed repapering, recarpeting, refurnishing, he decided. Nothing like cheerful surroundings for impressionable childhood. With this in view, he carried off Sheila one day to a firm of wallpaper dealers, so that she could choose a pattern for herself. Sheila sat solemnly on the sofa by his side, while the polite assistant turned over great strips of paper. At last she decided. A bewildering number of parrots to the square yard, all with red bodies and blue tails, darting about among green foliage on which pink roses grew miraculously, was the chosen design. Quixtus hesitated, but Sheila was firm. They proudly took home a strip to try against the wall. Clementina, hearing from Sheila of her exploit, rushed up the next afternoon to Russell Square, and blinked her eyes before the dazzling thing. "It's only you, Ephraim, that could have taken a child of 5 to select wallpapers." "I will own that the result is disastrous," he said briefly, "but she set her heart upon it." She sighed. "You're 2 babies together. I see I've got to fix up that nursery myself." She looked at him with a woman's delicious pity. What could a lone man know of the fitting up of nurseries? "You hear what your auntie says?" he asked. The child was sitting on his knee. "We're in disgrace." "If you're in disgrace, you go in the corner," said Sheila. "Let us go in the corner, then." "If you hold me very tight," said Sheila. But Clementina came up and forgave them, and kissed the little face peeping over Quixtus's shoulder. "Does my heart good to see you with her?" she cried, with rare demonstrativeness. It was true. Sheila's sweet ways with Tommy and Etta caused her ever so little a pang of jealousy. Her increasing fondness for Quixtus made Clementina thrill with pleasure. You may say that Clementina, essentially just, was scrupulous not to encroach upon Quixtus's legal half-share in the child's esteem, but a sense of justice is not an emotion. And it was emotion, silly, feminine, romantic emotion, which she did not try to explain to herself, that filled her eyes with moisture whenever she saw the 2 happy together. She laid her hand upon the fair hair. "Do you love your Uncle Ephraim?" "I adore him," said Sheila. "Your uncle fully reciprocates the sentiment, my dear," said Quixtus, his hand also instinctively rising to caress the hair. So the hands of the guardians touched. Clementina withdrew hers and turned away quickly, so that he should not see the flush that sprang into her face. "We must be going home now, dear," she said. "Auntie is wasting precious daylight." And with her old abruptness she left him. He followed her down the stairs. "My dear Clementina," said he, standing bareheaded at his front door, "I wonder whether you realize how Sheila and yourself light up this dull old house for me." She sniffed scornfully. "I light up?" "You," said he, with smiling emphasis. She looked at him queerly for an instant, and then went her way. The next time he saw her, a few days afterwards, one late afternoon, when she was tired after a heavy day's painting, she railed at him with a return of her old biting manner. He looked surprised and pained. She relented. "Forgive me, my good Ephraim," she said, "but I've the rough luck to be a woman. No man alive can ever conjecture what a devil of a thing that is to be." He smiled. "You mustn't overwork," said he. "A woman hasn't the brute strength of a man." "You're delicious," she said. But she was kind, exceedingly kind, to him thereafter, and fitted up the nursery in a way that made the 2 babies beam with delight. So Quixtus lived halcyon days. In spite of qualms of conscience, these were halcyon days for Huckabee. He had already entered on his duties as Quixtus's assistant in the preparation of the monumental work on the household arts of the Neolithic age. There were hundreds of marked passages in books to transcribe with accurate notes of reference, hundreds of learned periodicals in all languages with articles bearing on the subject to be condensed and indexed, thousands of notes of Quicks's to be collated, thousands of photographs and drawings to be classified. Never having been admitted into the inner factory of his patron's work, he was astonished at the enormous amount of material, the evidence of the unsuspected patient labour of years. He began to feel a new respect for Quickstus, whom hitherto he had regarded as a dilettante. Of course, he knew that Quickstus had a European reputation. He had not taken the reputation seriously. Like Clementina, he had been wont to scoff at prehistoric man. Now he realized for the first time that a man cannot gain a European reputation in any branch of human activity without paying the price in toil, that there are qualities of energy, brain, and will inherent in any man who takes front rank, that there must be a calm, infinite thoroughness in his work which is beyond the power of the smaller man. No wonder his French colleagues called Quickstus cher maître, and deferred to his judgment. In his workroom Quickstus was a great man, and Huckabee, seeing him now in his workroom, recognized the fact. The prospects of his appointment as secretary to the Anthropological Society were also fair. Hitherto the responsibilities of that position had been borne by one of the members in an honorary capacity, a paid and unimportant underling performing the clerical duties. But for the last year or so, the operations of the Society having extended, the secretaryship had become too great a tax on the time of any unpaid and no matter how enthusiastic gentleman. The Council therefore had practically determined on the appointment of a salaried secretary, and were much impressed by the qualifications of the President's nominee. A secretary who can print below his name on official papers the fact that he is a Master of Arts and late Fellow of his college lends distinction to any learned society. A snuffy, seedy, and crotchety member had been put forward as an opposition candidate, but his chances were small. Huckabee's star was in the ascendant. It was a happy day for him when he moved his books and few other belongings from the evil garret where he had lived to modest but cheerful lodgings near Russell Square. He looked for the last time around the room which had been the scene of so many degradations, of so many despairs, of so many torturings of soul. All that was a part of his past life, the greasy wallpaper, the rickety deal furniture, the filth-sodden ragged carpet, the slimy soot on the window-sill that had crept in from the circumambient chimney-stacks through the ill-fitting window-sash, the narrow, rank bed. All that had been part and parcel of his being. The familiar smell of uncared-for, unclean human lives saturated the house. He shuddered and slammed the door and tore down the stairs. Never again, so help him God. A short while afterwards he was busy arranging his books in the bright, clean sitting-room of his new lodgings, brought in afternoon tea, which he disposed in decent fashion on a little table. When she had gone, he stood and looked down upon the dainty array. He realized that henceforward this was his home. He picked up from the plate a little three-cornered watercress sandwich, but instead of eating it, he stared at it, and the tears rolled down his face. One day, however, towards the end of July, was marked by a black cloud. His day's work being over, he was walking with light step to his lodgings, when he saw in the distance, awaiting him, almost on his doorstep, the sinister forms of Billiter and Vandermeer. His first impulse was to turn and flee, but they had already caught sight of him and were advancing to meet him. He went on. "Hello, old friend," said Billiter in a beery voice. "So we tracked you down, eh? We called at the old place and found you'd gone and left no address. Thought you would give us the slip, eh?" He still wore the costume which he had gone racing with Quickstus, but after constant use it had begun to look shabby. His linen was of the dingiest, his face had grown more bloated. Vandermeer, pinched, foxy, and rusty, thrust his hard felt hat to the back of his head, and, hands on hips, looked threateningly at Huckabee. "I suppose you know you've been playing a low-down game?" "I know nothing of the sort," said Huckabee. "I know nothing of the sort," said Huckabee. "How don't you?" said Billiter. "Look at you and look at us. Who's been getting all the fat and who all the lean? We have something to say to you, old friend, so let's get indoors and have it out between us." He made a move, accompanied by Vandermeer, towards the front door, But Huckabee checked them, stricken with sudden revolt. His past life should not defile the sanctity of his new home. He would not admit them across his threshold. "No," said he. "Whatever we got to say one another can be said here." "All right," said Vandermeer sulkily. "There's a quiet pub at the corner." "I've chucked pubs," said Huckabee. "Come off it," sneered Billiter. "At any rate, you can stand a round of drinks." "I've chucked drink, too," said Huckabee. "I've sworn off. I'll never touch a drop of liquor as long as I live, and I advise you fellows to do the same." They burst out laughing, asked him for tickets for his next temperance lecture, and then began to abuse him after the manner of their kind. "This is a decent street," said Huckabee, "so please don't make a row." "We're not making any row," cried Billiter. "We only want our share of the money." "What money? Didn't I write and tell you the whole thing was off? She couldn't stick it, and neither could I. Quicksters hasn't given her one penny piece." "We'll see what the lady has to say about that," growled Billiter. "You're going to leave that lady alone henceforth and for ever," said Huckabee, with a new ring of authority in his voice. The others sneered. Since when had Huckabee constituted himself squire of dames? Billiter, with profane asseveration, would do exactly what he chose. Wasn't it his scheme? He deserved his share. Vandermeer gloomily reminded him that he had cast doubts from the first on Huckabee's probity. He had put them in the cart in fine fashion. They refused to believe in Lena Fontaine's squeamishness. Huckabee grew impatient. "Haven't you each received a letter from Quickster's solicitors? Haven't you each signed an agreement not to worry him on forfeiture of your allowance? Now I swear to God that if either of you molest him, you'll be molesting Quicksters. I'll jolly well see to that. She'll tell me, and I'll tell him, and bang goes the monthly money." Vandermeer's shrewd wits began to work. "Molest her, and we molest Quicksters? Oh, is that the little game? She's going to marry him, eh?" "If she does, what the blazes has that got to do with you?" Huckabee cried fiercely. "You just let the woman alone. You've got a damn sight more out of Quicksters than you ever expected, and you ought to be satisfied." "We ought to get more," said Billiter, "considering what we've done for him." "You won't," said Huckabee. And seeing that they both still regarded Quicksters as a subject for further exploitation, "Let me tell you something," said he, "a few simple facts that alter the situation completely. Let us take a turn down the street." And as they walked, he told them briefly of Hammersley's death and the Marseille visit, and the return of Quicksters, a changed man, with Clementina and the child. The bee, on which they had reckoned for honey, had left Quicksters's bonnet. There was no more bedlamite talk about wickedness. Their occupation as evil counsellors had gone for ever. They had better accept thankfully what they had, and disappear. Any action directed against either Quicksters or Lena Fontaine would automatically bring about the demise of the goose with the golden eggs. At last he convinced them of the futility of blackmail, but they parted from him each with a burning sense of wrong. Lena Fontaine and Huckabee had put them in the cart. They were left, they were done, they were stung. They were all things that slang has invented to describe the position of men deceived by those in whom they trusted. "And she's going to marry him," said Vandermeer. "Huckabee didn't say so," replied Billiter. "He didn't contradict it. She's going to marry him, and you bet that son of a pawn ticket will get his commission." "Well, we can't help ourselves," said Billiter. Said Vandermeer darkly. Huckabee, conscious of victory, went home, and taking an old student's text of the Phaedo from his shelves, abstracted his mind from the sordid happenings of the modern world. It was a day or two after this adventure of Huckabee's that Quicksters informed Clementina of his intention of giving a dinner party in honour of Tommy and Etta's engagement. She commended the project. A nice little intimate dinner. "I'm afraid I'm planning rather a large affair," said he apologetically. "A party of about 20 people." "Lord save us!" cried Clementina. "Where are you going to dig them up from?" He stretched out his long, thin legs. They were sitting on a bench in the gardens of Russell Square, Sheila having strayed a few yards to investigate the contents of a perambulator in charge of a smiling and friendly nursemaid. "There are people to whom I owe a return of hospitality," said he with a smile, "and I think a certain amount of formality is due to Admiral Concannon." "All right," said Clementina. "Who are they?"
There are the Admiral, and yourself, and Tommy and Etta, Lord and Lady Radfield, General and Mrs. Barnes, Sir Edward and Lady Quinn, Dawley, the novelist, you know, Mrs. Fontaine and Lady Louisa Morling."
Clementina stiffened. The blood seemed to flow from her heart, leaving it an intolerable icicle. "Why Mrs. Fontaine?"
"Why not?
"Why should Mrs. Fontaine be asked to Etta's party?"
She's a charming woman," said Quicksters.
"Just a shallow society hack," said Clementina, to whom Quicksters had not confided his adventures in the gay world, not through conscious disingenuousness, but assuming that such chronicles would not interest her.
"I'm afraid you do her an injustice," he said warmly. "Mrs. Fontaine has very brilliant social gifts. I'm sorry, my dear Clementina, that we disagree on the point, but anyhow she must be invited. As a matter of fact, it was she who suggested the party."
Clementina opened her lips to speak, and then closed them with a snap. Mother Eve sat at her elbow and murmured words of good counsel. Not by abuse is an infatuated and quixotic man weaned from seductresses. She swallowed her anger and fierce jealousy. "In that case, my dear Ephraim," she said with mincing civility, "there is no question about it. Of course she must be invited."
"Of course," said he.
"Who else are to come?" He ran through the list. One or two of the prospective guests she knew personally, others by name. As to the personalities of those unknown to her, she made polite inquiries. So unwontedly sugared were her phrases that Quicksters, simple man, forgot her outburst. "You haven't given a dinner party like this for a long time."
"Not for many years. Of course I've had men's dinners, chiefly my colleagues in the Anthropological Society, but this is a new venture."
"I wish it every success," said Clementina mendaciously. "The only wrong note in it would be myself." "Oh yes, my dear Ephraim," she said, anticipating his protest. "I'm not made for such a galaxy of fashion. I tread upon daintily covered corns. I'm a savage. All right in my wigwam with those I care for, but no use in a drawing-room. You must leave me out of it." Quicksters, shocked and hurt, turned and put out both hands in appeal.
"My dearest friend, how can you say such things? You positively must come."
"My dearest friend," she replied, forcing her grin lips into a smile, "I positively won't." And that was the end of the matter. She parted from him cordially, and went home with more devils tearing her to pieces with red-hot pincers than had ever been dreamed of in Quicksters's demonology. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Glory of Clementina Wing by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 22. Romney Place slumbered in the afternoon sunshine. Most of the blinds of the early Victorian houses were drawn, symbols of quietude within. A Persian cat walking across the roadway stopped in the middle, after the manner of cats, and leisurely made her toilette. A milk cart progressed discreetly from door to door, and the milkman handed the cans to hands upstretched from areas with unclattering and non-flirtatious punctilio. When he had finished his round and disappeared by the church, the street was empty for a moment. The cat resumed her journey and sat on a doorstep, blinking in the sun. Presently a foxy-faced man, shabbily clad, entered this peaceful scene and walked slowly down the pavement. It was Vandermeer, still burning with a sense of wrong, yearning for vengeance, yet trembling at the prospect of wreaking it. At Tommy's door he hesitated. Of his former visit to the young man no pleasant recollections lingered. Tommy's manners were impulsive rather than urbane. Would he listen to Vandermeer's story, or would he kick him out of the house? Vandermeer, starting out on his pilgrimage to Romney Place, had fortified himself with the former conjecture. Now that he had come to the end of it, the latter appeared inevitable. He always shrank from physical violence. It would hurt very much to be kicked out of the house, to say nothing of the moral damage. He hovered in agonizing uncertainty, and took off his hat, for the afternoon was warm. Now, while he was mopping the brow of dubiety, a front door lower down the street opened, and a nurse and a little girl appeared. They descended the steps and walked past him. Vandermeer looked after them for a moment, then stuck on his hat and punched the left-hand palm with the right-hand fist, with the air of a man to whom has occurred an inspiration. Miss Clementina Wing also lived in Romney Place. That must be the child, Quickstus's ward, of whom Huckaby had spoken. It would be much better to take his story to Clementina Wing, now so intimately associated with Quickstus. Women, he argued, are much more easily inveigled into intrigue than men, and they don't kick you out of the house in a manner to cause bodily pain. Besides, Clementina had once befriended him. Why had he not thought of her before? He walked boldly up the steps and rang the bell. Clementina was fiercely painting drapery from the lay figure, a grey silk dress full of 1,000 folds and shadows. The texture was not coming right. The more she painted, the less like silk did it look. Now was it muddy canvas, now fluffy wool. Every touch was wrong. Every stroke of the brush since her yesterday's talk with Quickstus was wrong. She could not paint. Yet in a frenzy of anger she determined to paint. What had the woman invited to Quickstus's dinner party to do with her art? She would make the thing come right. She would prove to herself that she was a woman of genius, that she had not her sex hanging round the neck of her spirit. If Quickstus chose to make a fool of himself with Mrs. Fontaine, in heaven's name let him do so. She had her work to do. She would do it, in spite of all the society hacks in Christendom. The skirt began to look like a blanket stained with coffee. Let him have his dinner party. What was there of importance in so contemptible a thing as a dinner party? But this infernal woman had suggested it. How far was he compromised with this infernal woman? She could wring her neck. The dress began to suggest a humorously streaky London fog. "Damn the thing!" cried Clementina, wiping the whole skirt out. "I'll stand here forever until I get it right." Her tea, on a little table at the other end of the studio, remained untouched. Her hair fell in loose strands over her forehead, and she pushed it back every now and then with impatient fingers. The front door-bell rang, and soon her maid appeared at the gallery door. "A gentleman to see you, ma'am." "I can't see anybody. You know I can't. Tell him to go away." The maid came down the stairs. "I told him you weren't into anybody, but he insisted. He hasn't a card, but wrote his name on a slip of paper. Here it is, ma'am." Clementina angrily took the slip. Mr. Vandermeer would be glad to see Miss Wing on the most urgent business. "Tell him I can't see him." The maid mounted the stairs. Vandermeer? Vandermeer. Where had she heard that name before? Suddenly she remembered. "All right, show him down here," she shouted to the disappearing maid. She might just as well see him. If she sent him away, the buzzing worry of conjecture as to his urgent business would flitter about her mind. She threw down her palette and brush, and impatiently rubbed her hands together. Into what shape of moral flaccidity was she weakening? 5 months ago, all the urgent business of all the Vandermeers in the world could go hang when she was painting, and could not get a thing right. Why should she be different now from the Clementina of 5 months ago? Why? With exasperated hands she further confounded the confusion of her hair. The introduction of Vandermeer put a stop to these questionings. She received him, arms akimbo, at a short distance from the foot of the stairs. "I must apologize, Miss Wing, for this intrusion," said he, "but perhaps you may remember—" Yes, she interrupted. "Ham and beef shop, which you transmogrified into a restaurant. Also Mr. Burgrave. What do you want? I'm very busy." The sight of the mean little figure holding his felt hat with both hands in front of him, with his pointed face, ferret eyes, and red crinkly hair, did not in any way redeem her remembered impression. "A very grave danger is threatening Dr. Quickstus," said he. "It is impossible for me to warn him myself, so I have come to you as a friend of his." "Danger?" cried Clementina, taken off her guard. "What kind of danger?" "You will only understand if I tell you rather a long story, but first I must have your promise of secrecy as far as I am concerned." "Don't like secrecy," said Clementina. "You can take whatever action you like," he said hastily. "It's in order that you may act in his interest that I'm here. I only want you to give me your word that you won't compromise me personally. I assure you, you'll see why when I tell you the story." Clementina reflected for a moment. It was a danger threatening Quickstus. It might be important. This little weasel of a man was of no account. "All right," she said. "I give my word. Go ahead." She took a pinch of tobacco from the yellow package and a cigarette paper, and, sitting in a chair in the cool draught of the door opening onto the garden, with shaky fingers rolled a cigarette. "Sit down. You can smoke if you like. You can also help yourself to tea. I won't have any." Vandermeer poured himself out some tea and cut an enormous hunk of cake. I warn you," said he, drawing a chair within conversational distance, "that the story will be a long one. I wanted to begin from the beginning." "Go ahead, for goodness' sake," said Clementina. Vandermeer was astute enough to conjecture that a sudden denunciation of Mrs. Fontaine might defeat his object by exciting her generous indignation, whereas, by gradually arousing her interest in the affairs of Quickstus, the climatic introduction of the execrated lady might pass almost unrecognised. "The story has to do, in the first place," said he, with 3 men, John Billiter, Eustace Huckerby, and myself." "Huckerby?" cried Clementina, startled. "What has he to do with you?" "The biggest blackguard of us all," said Vandermeer. Clementina lay back in her chair, her attention caught at once. "Go on," she said. Whereupon Vandermeer began, and with remorseless veracity, for here truth was far more effective than fiction, told the story of the relations of the 3 with Quickstus in the days of their comparative prosperity, when he himself was on the staff of a newspaper, Billiter in possession of the fag end of his fortune, and Huckerby a tutor at Cambridge. He told how, one by one, they sank, how Quickstus held out the helping hand. He told of the weekly dinners, the overcoat pockets. "Not a soul on earth but you 3 knew anything about it?" asked Clementina in a quavering voice. "As far as I know, not a soul." He told of the drunken dinner, of Quickstus's anger, of the cessation of the intercourse, of the extraordinary evening when Quickstus had invited them to be his ministers of evil, of his madness, of his fixed idea to work wickedness, of his own suggestion as regards Tommy. "You infamous devil!" said Clementina between her set teeth. In her wildest conjectures she had never imagined so grotesque and so pitiable a history. She sat absorbed, pale-cheeked, holding the extinct stump of cigarette between her fingers. Vandermeer paid no attention to the ejaculation. He proceeded with his story, told of Billiter and the turf, of Huckerby and the heart-breaking adventure. "Oh, my God!" cried Clementina. "Oh, my God!" He told of the meetings in the tavern, of the hunger and misery of the 3, of the plot to use a decoy woman in Paris, who was to bleed him to the extent of £3,000. "What's her name?" she cried, her lips parted in an awful surmise. "Lena Fontaine," said Vandermeer. Clementina grew very white and fell back into her chair. She felt faint. She had worked violently, she had felt violently since early morning. Vandermeer started up. "Can I get you anything? Some water? Some tea?" "Nothing," she said shortly. The idea of receiving anything from his abhorrent hands acted as a shock. "I'm all right. Go on. Tell me all you know about her." He related the unsavoury details that he had gleaned from Billiter, scrupulously explaining that these were at second hand. Finally he informed her with fair accuracy of Huckerby's latest report, giving, however, his own interpretation of Huckerby's conduct, and laid the position of Billiter and himself before her. "You see," said he, "how important it was for me to obtain your pledge of secrecy." "And what do you get out of coming to me with this story?" Vandermeer rose and held his hand tight. "Nothing, except the satisfaction of having queered the damned pitch of both of them." Clementina shrank together in her chair, her hand tight over her face, all her flesh a shuddering horror. Then she waved both hands at him blindly. "Go away! Go away!" she said in a hoarse whisper. Vandermeer's shifty eyes glanced from Clementina to a stool beside his chair. On it lay the great hunk of cake which he had cut, but had not been able to eat during his narration. She was not looking. He pocketed the cake and turned. But Clementina had seen. She uttered a cry of anguish and horror. "Oh, God, are you as hungry as that? You'll find some money in that end drawer." She pointed to an oak dresser against the gallery wall. "Take what you want to buy food with and go. Only go." Vandermeer opened the drawer, took out a £5 note, and having mounted the stairs, left the studio. Clementina staggered into the little garden, her brain reeling. She, who thought she had fathomed the depths of life, and, scornful of her knowledge thereof, rode serene on the surface, knew nothing. Nothing of the wolf instinct of man when hunger drives. Nothing of the degradation of a man when the drink fiend clutches at his throat. Lord,
How sweet the air, even in this ridiculous little London garden, after the awful atmosphere of that beast of prey. Quickstus. All her heart went out to him in fierce love and pity. Generous, high-souled gentleman at the mercy of these ravening wolves. She walked round and round the little garden path. Things obscure to her gradually became clear, but many remained dark, maddeningly impenetrable. Something had happened to throw the beloved man off his balance. The marital trial might well be a factor, but was that enough? Yet what did the past matter? The present held peril. The web was being woven tight around him. She had hated the woman intuitively at first sight, had dreaded complications. It was a million times worse than she had in her most jealous dreams conceived. If he were lured into marriage, what but disaster could be the end? And Sheila? Her blood froze at the thought of her darling coming into contact with the woman. All her sex clamoured. Before she acted, every dark corner must be illuminated. There must be no groping, no false movement. One man would certainly be able to throw light. Huckerby, the trusted friend of Quickstus. The more she thought of him, the more she was amazed. Here was one of the ghastly band, an illimitable scoundrel, the one who had openly suggested to Quickstus the most despicable, yet the most fantastic, wickedness of all. Now the confidential secretary, the collaborator, the fidus Acchates of the sane and disillusioned gentleman. With sudden decision she marched into the studio and took up the telephone and gave a number. Quickstus's voice eventually answered. "Who was there?" "It's me, Clementina. Is Mr. Huckerby still with you?" Huckerby had left half an hour ago. "Can you give me his address? I want to ask him to come and see me, to come to tea. I like him so much, you know." The address came through the telephone. She noted it in her memory. Quickstus inquired for Sheila. Clementina gave him cheery news and rang off. All this was arrant disingenuousness and duplicity. But Clementina did not care. What woman ever does? She ran up to her bedroom, thrust on a coat, pinned on the hat with the wobbly rose, and went out. In the King's Road she found a taxicab. A quarter of an hour brought her to Huckerby's lodgings. He had spent a happy and untroubled day, and was finishing the Fido with great enjoyment, when Clementina burst into the room. He leaped from his chair in amazement. "My dear Miss Wing!" "You infernal villain!" said Clementina. Huckerby staggered back. To such a salutation it is difficult to respond in the ordinary terms of hospitality. "Will you take a seat," said he, and explain?" He drew a chair to the open window. She plumped herself down. "I think it's for you to explain," she said. "I presume," said Huckerby after a pause, "that something in connection with my past life has come to your ears. I will grant that there was in it much that was not particularly creditable, but my conscience now is free from reproach." Clementina sniffed. "You must have a very accommodating conscience. What about Dr. Quickstus and Mrs. Fontaine?" "Well, what about it?" "You know the kind of woman Mrs. Fontaine is. You introduced her to him, and yet you are allowing her to inveigle him into marriage. Oh, don't deny it. I know the whole infamous conspiracy from A to Z." Huckerby stifled an oath. "Those brutes Vandermeer and Billiter have been giving the woman away to you." He clenched his fists. "The blackguards!" "I don't know anything about What's-his-name, or the other man. I only know one thing. This marriage is not going to take place. I might have gone straight to Dr. Quickstus, but I thought it best to see you first. There are various things I want cleared up." Huckerby looked at the woman's strong, rugged face, and then his eyes wandered round the little cool haven that was his home, and a great fear fell upon him. If Quickstus learnt the truth now about Mrs. Fontaine, he would never be forgiven. He would be put on the same footing as the two others, and then the abyss. Of course he could lie, and Mrs. Fontaine could lie, but what would be the use? The revelation of the true facts to Quickstus would fit in only too well with his past disingenuousness, and with his urgent insistence on the heart-breaking adventure. And his iron-faced visitor would soon see to it that the lies were swept away. His face grew ashen. "You have me in your power," he said humbly. "Once I was a gentleman and a scholar. Then there were years of degradation. Now, thanks to Quickstus, I'm on the way to becoming my former self." If you denounce me to Quixtus, I go back. For sheer pity's sake, don't do it." "Let me hear what you've got to say for yourself," said Clementina grimly. "What are Quixtus's feelings with regard to Mrs. Fontaine, I don't know. He's never spoken to me on the subject, but he certainly admires her for what she really is, a charming, well-bred woman." "Ha!" said Clementina. "Suppose," continued Huckabee, "suppose we were drawn into this conspiracy. Suppose, when we came to put it into practice, both our souls revolted. Suppose she began to like Quixtus for his own sake. Suppose her soul also revolted from her past life." "Fiddlesticks!" said Clementina. "I assure you it's true," he said earnestly. "Let us suppose it is, anyway. Suppose she saw in a marriage with a good man her salvation. Suppose she was ready to make him a good wife. Suppose I thoroughly believed her. How could I, clinging to the same plank as she, do otherwise than I have done? Keep silent?" "Your duty to your benefactor should certainly outweigh your supposed duty to this worthless creature." Huckabee sighed. "That's the woman's point of view." Clementina made an angry gesture. "I suppose you're right. Always the confounded woman's point of view, when one wants to look at things judicially. Yes, you couldn't give the woman away. A man's perverted notion. I see. Well, let us take it, for the sake of argument, that I believe you. What then?" "I don't know," said he. "Mrs. Fontaine and myself are at your mercy." "Humph!" said Clementina again. She paused, glanced shrewdly at his face as he sat forward in the chair on the opposite side of the window, twisting nervous fingers and staring out across the street. "Tell me your story, frankly, of Dr. Quixtus," she said at last, "from the time of the Marrable trial. As many details as you can remember. I want to know." Huckabee obeyed. He was, as he said, at her mercy. His story confirmed Vandermeer's, but it covered a wider ground, and told with truer perception, cast the desired light on dark places. She learned for the first time, for hitherto she had concerned herself little with Quixtus's affairs, the fact of his disinheritance, Quixtus having one raging day revealed to Huckabee the history of the cynical will. She questioned him about Will Hammersley. His account of Quixtus's half-given and hastily snatched confidence was a lightning flash. Clementina rose, aghast, and walked about the room. The idea of such a horror had never entered her head. Hammersley and Angela? It was incredible, impossible. There must have been some awful hallucination. That Hammersley, Bayard without fear and without reproach, and Angela, quiet, colourless saint, could have done this thing, baffled all imaginings of human passion. It was inconceivable, ludicrous, grotesque. But to Quixtus it was real. He believed it. It lay at the root of his disorder. Even now, with his disorder cured, he believed it still. She was rent with his anguish. My God, how he must have suffered! And in spite of everything, said Huckabee, he is as tender to Hammersley's little daughter as if she were his own. She swooped upon him in her abrupt fashion. Thank you for that. You've got a heart somewhere about you. She sat down again. When do you think this suspicion, or whatever it was, crossed his mind? Let us go back. They talked long and earnestly. At length, Huckabee having ransacked his memory of things past, they fixed as a probable date the day of the hostless dinner. Quixtus had sent down word that he was ill. The excuse was entirely false. Nothing but severe mental trouble could have stood in the way of his taking the head of the table. Obviously something had happened. Huckabee had a vague memory of seeing Quixtus, as he entered the museum, crush a letter in his hand and stuff it in his jacket pocket. It might possibly have been a letter incriminating the pair. Whether the conjecture was right or wrong did not greatly matter. Clementina felt now that she held the key to Quixtus's mad conduct. Blow after blow had fallen on him. Those whom he had trusted had betrayed him. He had lost faith in humanity. The gentle nature could not withstand this loss of faith. There had been shock. He had set out to work devildom. The pity of it! She uttered a queer, choking laugh. Not one piece of wickedness could he commit.
The summer twilight began to creep over the quiet street, and the darkness deepened at the back of the room. A long silence fell upon them. Clementina sat as motionless as a dusky sphinx, absorbed by strange thoughts and wrung by strange emotions that made her bosom heave and her breath come quickly. A scheme, audacious, fantastic, romantic, began to shape itself in her mind, sending the blood tingling down to her feet, to her fingertips. At last she made an abrupt movement. "It's getting dark. What can the time be? I must go home." She rose. "Before I go," she said, "we must settle up about Mrs. Fontaine." "I suppose we must," groaned Huckabee. "All I ask you is to spare her as much as you can." "We must think first of Quickstus," she replied shortly. "What we have got to do for him is to build up his faith in humanity again, not to give the little he has left another knock-down blow. See?" Huckabee raised his head with swift hope. "Do you mean that he must not know about her?" "Or about you, that's what I mean." "God bless you," gasped Huckabee. "All the same, this precious marriage project has got to be put a stop to, for ever and ever, amen. I hope you realise that thoroughly." Huckabee could not meet her keen eyes. He hung his head. "I suppose you mean me to break it gently to her that the game is up?" "I don't mean anything of the kind," she snapped. "Now look here, pay strict attention. If you obey me implicitly and scrupulously, I'll still see whether I can't be your friend, and I can be a good friend. But if you don't, God help you. I've given a pledge of secrecy to my informant this afternoon. Of course I've broken it like a woman, so you've got to keep it for me. See? You're not to let those two blackguards suffer in any way on my account. Promise." "I promise," said Huckabee. "Then you're not to breathe a single syllable to Mrs. Fontaine. Best keep out of her way. Leave me to deal with her. I'll let her down gently, I'll give you my word on it. Is that a bargain?" "Yes," said Huckabee. She put out her hand frankly. "Good-bye." He accompanied her to the front door. "Can I get you a taxi?" "Lord, no. When I'm a lady, you can. I'll walk till I find one." Clementina sped to Romney Place with shining eyes and a smile lurking at the corners of her lips. The first thing she did on arrival was to rush down to the telephone. "Is that you, Ephraim?" "Yes," came the answer. "I've changed my mind, and I'm coming to your dinner party." "Delighted, my dear Clementina." "Good-bye." She ran off and rushed upstairs to make a fool of herself over Sheila, who, already put to bed, lay awake in anticipation of Clementina's good-night cuddle. "When you go to stay with your uncle, I wonder whether he'll spoil you like this." "You'll come too," said Sheila sedately, "and then you can go on spoiling me." "Lord preserve us!" cried Clementina. "What a scandal in Russell Square!" Towards 10 o'clock Tommy made his appearance. The daily calls to inquire after her health and happiness had grown to be a sacred observance. But as the studio was rigorously closed to him during the daylight hours, his visits were vespertilian. If she wanted him, she told him to stay. If she didn't, she sent him about his business. He got into the habit of kissing her, nephew fashion, when they met and parted. She liked the habit now, for she felt that the boy loved her very dearly, and in an aunt-like and very satisfying and comfortable way, she too loved him with all her heart. "Can I stay?" She nodded. He removed the set palette from the chair onto which she had cast it when Vandermeer was announced, and sat down. "What have you been doing with yourself?" He entered upon a long story. Some picture or the other was shaping splendidly. His uncle had taken Etta and himself to lunch at the Savoy. Said he was thinking of going to Dinar for August. Rum place for him to go, isn't it? Clementina repressed manifestation of interest in the announcement, but it set her pulses throbbing. "I suppose he can go where he likes, can't he?" she snapped. "What kind of a lunch did you have?" Tommy ran through the menu. It was his own selection. He'd given the dear old chap some hints in gastronomy. It was wonderful how little he knew of such essential things. Seemed to have set his heart on giving them pheasant in July. After that they'd gone to see the New Futurists. His uncle seemed to know all about them. Wonderful work, but they were all erring after false gods. He thanked heaven he had her, Clementina, to keep him orthodox. It was all absinthe and morphia. He rattled on. Clementina, leaning far back in her chair, watched the curls of cigarette smoke with shining eyes and a Leonardesque smile lurking at the corners of her lips. "Why, Clementina," he cried with sudden indignation, "you're paying not the slightest attention to me." "Never mind, Tommy," she said. "You go on talking. It helps me to think. I'm going to have a devil of a time. The time of my life." "What in the world are you going to do?" "Never mind, Tommy, never mind. Oh, what a fool I was not to think of it before." End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Glory of Clementina Wing by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 23. The next morning Clementina put off a sitter, a thing which she had never done before, and, letting work go hang, made an unprecedented irruption into Russell Square. "It's about this dinner of yours," she said as soon as Quicksters appeared. "I telephoned you yesterday that I was coming."
"And I said, my dear Clementina, that I was more than delighted."
"It was the morose warthog inside me that made me decline," she said frankly. "But there's a woman of sense also inside me that can cut the throat of the warthog when it likes. So here I am, a woman of sense. Now will you let a woman of sense run this dinner party for you? Oh, I know what you may be thinking," she went on hastily, without giving him time to reply. "I'm not going to suggest liver and bacon and a boiled potato. I know how things should be done better than you."
"I'm afraid I'm inexperienced in entertainments of this kind," said Quicksters with a smile. "Spriggs generally attends to such matters."
"Spriggs and I will put our heads together," said Clementina. "I want you to give rather a wonderful dinner party. What kind of table decorations have you?" Spriggs was summoned. He loaded the dining-room table with family plate and table centres and solid cut glass. His pride lay in a mid-Victorian épergne that at every banquet in the house proudly took the place of honour, with a fat load of grapes and oranges and apples. Clementina set apart a few articles of silver and condemned the rest, including the épergne, as horrors. "You'll let me have the pleasure, Ephraim," she said, "of providing all the flowers and making out a scheme of decoration. Anything I want I'll get myself and make you a present of it. I'm by way of being an artist, you know, so it will be all right."
"Could anyone doubt it?" said Quicksters. "I'm very much indebted to you, Clementina."
"A woman comes in useful now and then. I've never done a hand's turn for you, and it's time I began. You'll want a hostess, won't you?"
"Dear me," said Quicksters, somewhat taken aback. "I suppose I shall. I never thought of it."
"I'll be hostess," said Clementina. "I'm a kind of aunt to Tommy and Etta, for whom you're giving the party. I'm a kind of connection of yours, and you and I are a kind of father and mother to Sheila, so it will be quite correct. Let me have your list of guests, and don't you worry your head about anything." Clementina, in her sweeping mood, was irresistible. Quicksters, mild man, could do no more than acquiesce gratefully. It was most gracious of Clementina to undertake these perplexing arrangements. New sides of her character exhibited themselves every day. There was only one flaw in the newly revealed Clementina, her unaccountable disparagement of Mrs. Fontaine, but even this defect she remedied of her own accord. "I take back what I said about Mrs. Fontaine," she said abruptly. "I was in a warthoggy humour. She's a charming woman with brilliant social gifts." Quicksters beamed, whereat Clementina felt more warthoggy than ever, but she beamed also with a mansuetude that would have deceived Mrs. Fontaine herself. Clementina, after an intimate interview with the first resentful, then obfuscated, and finally boneless and submissive Spriggs, went her way, a sparkle of triumph in her eyes. And then began laborious days, during which she sacrificed many glorious hours of daylight to the arrangements for the dinner party. She spent an incredible time in antique shops and schools of art needlework, and even haunted places near the London docks, hunting for the glass and embroideries and other things she needed. She ordered rare flowers from florists. She wasted her evenings over a watercolour design for the table decoration, and over designs for the menu and name cards. "It's going to be a dinner that people shall remember," she said to Etta. "It's going to be splendid," said Etta. "You think of everything, darling, except the one thing, the most important." "What's that, child?" "Have you got a dress to wear, darling?"
"Dress?"
echoed Clementina, staring at the child. "Why, of course I've got my black." Etta stood aghast.
That old thing you took with you packed anyhow on the motor trip? Naturally. Isn't it good enough for you? It's not for me, said Etta, growing bold. I love you in anything. It's for the other people. Do go and get yourself a nice frock. There's still time. I've never liked to tell you before, dear, but the old one gapes at the back, and—" She paused dramatically. "Gapes dreadfully." "Oh, Lord, let it gape!" cried Clementina impatiently. "Don't worry me." But Etta continued to worry, with partial success. Clementina obstinately refused to buy new raiment, but consented to call in Miss Pugsley, the little dressmaker round the corner in the King's Road, who fashioned such homely garments as Clementina deigned to wear, and to hand over the old black dress to her for alterations and repairs. Etta sighed, and spent anxious hours with Miss Pugsley, and forced a grumbling and sarcastic Clementina to stand half-clad while the frumpy rag attained something resembling a fit. "At any rate there are no seams burst, and it does hook together," said Etta, dismally surveying the horror at the final fitting. "Huh!" said Clementina, contemplating herself wryly in the mirror. "I suppose I look like a lady. Now I hope you're satisfied." Meanwhile, such painting as she did in the intervals of her daily excursions abroad progressed exceedingly. Tommy, coming into the studio one evening, caught sight of the picture of the lady in the grey dress standing on its easel. "Stunning!" he cried. "Stunning! You can almost hear the stuff rustle. How the dickens do you get your texture? You're a holy mystery. By Jove, you are! All this—" he ran his thumb parallel with a fold in the drapery. "All this is a miracle." He turned and faced her with worshipping eyes in which the tears were ready to spring. "By God, you're great!" The artist was thrilled by the homage. The woman laughed inwardly. She had dashed at the tasks triumphantly, and as if by magic the thing had come out right. She was living, these days, intensely. There was no miracle that she could not work. A morning or two afterwards she issued a ukase to Tommy and Etta that they were to accompany her on an automobile excursion. Tommy, to whom she had constituted herself task-mistress, boyishly glad of the holiday, flew down Romney Place and found a great luxurious hired motor standing at her door. Presently Etta arrived, and then Clementina and Sheila and the young lovers started. Where were they going? Clementina explained. As she could not keep Sheila in London during August, she had decided on taking a furnished cottage in the country. Estate agents had highly recommended one at Moleham-on-Thames. She was going down to have a look at it, and wanted their advice. The motor ploughed through the squalor of Brentford, and then sped along the Bath Road, through Colnbrook and Slough and Maidenhead, and through the glorious greenery in which Henley is embowered, and on by winding shady roads, with here and there a flashing glimpse of river, by fields lush in golden pasture, up and down the gentle hills, through riverside villages where sleeping gaiety brings a smile to the eyes, between the high hedges of Oxfordshire lanes, through the cool verdant mystery of beech woods, until it entered through a great gateway and proceeded up a long avenue of elms, and stopped before a slumbering red-brick manor-house. "This the cottage?" asked Tommy. "Do you think it's a waterfall?" asked Clementina. They alighted. A caretaker took the auditor view given by the estate agents, and conducted the party over the place. The more Tommy saw, the more amazed did he grow. There was a park, a garden, a pergola of roses, a couple of tennis courts, a lawn reaching to the river. The house, richly furnished throughout, contained rooms innumerable, 4 or 5 sitting rooms, large dining room, billiard room, countless bedrooms, a magnificent studio. In the grounds another studio. "I'll take it," said Clementina. "But, my dear," gasped Tommy, "have you considered— I don't want to be impertinent, but the rent of this place must be £1,000 a minute." She drew him apart from Etta and Sheila. "My dear boy," she said, "for no reason that I can see, I've lived all my life on 2d a year. It's only quite lately that I've realized that I'm a very rich woman and can do anything more or less I please. I'm going to take this place for August and September and hire a motor car, and you and Etta are going to stay with me, and you can each bring as many idiot boys and girls as you choose, and I shall paint, and you can paint, and Sheila can run about the garden, and we're all going to enjoy ourselves." Tommy thrust his hands into the pockets of his grey flannels, and declared she was a wonder. Whereupon they proceeded to Moleham, and after lunch at the Black Boy, motored back to Chelsea.
These were days filled with a myriad activities. The dinner party engaged her curious attention. She sent back proofs of the menu and name cards time after time to the firm of art printers before she was satisfied. Then she took them to Quickster's. He was delighted.
"But, my dear Clementina, why are you taking all this ridiculous trouble?"
She laughed in her gruff way, and summoned Spriggs to another dark and awful interview. A day or two before the dinner, Mrs. Fontaine, who, although she had suggested the idea, did not view a dinner party as a world-shaking phenomenon, bethought her of the matter. A pretty little note had summoned Quickster's to tea. They were alone. "I have been wondering, my dear Dr. Quicksters," she said sweetly, her soft eyes on his, as soon as she had heard of the acceptances of the people in whom she was interested, "I have been wondering whether we are good enough friends for me to be audacious." He smiled an assurance. "If I brought you a few flowers for the table, would you accept them? And if you did, would you let me come and arrange them for you? It would be such a pleasure. Even the best trained servants can't give the little touch that a woman can." Quicksters blushed. It was difficult to be ungracious to the flower of womanhood. But the flower of womanhood had come too late in the day with her gracious proposal. He explained, wishing to soften the necessary refusal, that he had already called in the help of his artistic friends, Miss Clementina Wing and Tommy Burgrave. "Why didn't you send for me? Didn't you think of me?"
"I did not venture," said he.
"I have been deluding myself with the fancy that we were friends." She sighed and looked at him with feminine significance. "Nothing venture, nothing win." But Quickster's, simple soul, was too genuinely distressed by obvious happenings to follow the insidious scent. With great wisdom, Clementina had shown him her water-colour design, and he knew that Mrs. Fontaine, with all her daintiness, could not compete with the faultless taste and poetic imagination of a great artist. He wondered why so finely sensitive a nature as the flower of womanhood did not divine this. Her insistence jarred on him ever so little, and yet he shrank from wounding susceptibilities.
"I never thought you would be interested in such trivial domestic matters," said he.
"It is the little things that count." For the first time in his intercourse with her, he felt uncomfortable. Here was the lady maintaining her reproach of neglect. If she took so much interest in this wretched dinner-party, why had she not offered her services at once? Unwittingly he contrasted her inaction with Clementina's irresistible energy. In answer to her remark he said, smiling,
"I'm not so sure about that, although it's often asserted. We lawyers have an axiom, de minimis non curat lex."
"Pity a poor woman, what on earth does that mean?" He translated,
"The law is one thing, and human sentiment another."
With all her rough contradiction and violent assertion, Clementina never pinned him down to a fine point of sentimental argument. There was a spaciousness about Clementina wherein he could breathe freely. This close atmosphere began to grow distasteful. There was a slight pause, which Mrs. Fontaine filled in by handing him his second cup of tea.
"Miss Clementina Wing," said he, dashing for the open, "is so intimately associated not only with the object of our little entertainment, but also with myself in other matters, that I could do no less than consult her."
Lina Fontaine bent forward, sugar tongs in hand, ready to drop a lump into his cup, a charmingly intimate pose. "Of course I understand, dear Dr. Quicksters. And is she really coming to the dinner?"
"Why not?"
"She's so unconventional. I thought she never went into society."
"She is honouring me by making an exception in my case," replied Quicksters, a little stiffly.
"I'm delighted to hear it," she said sweetly, but in her heart she bitterly resented Clementina's interference. She would get even with the fish-fag for this. On the morning of the dinner party, Clementina sent for Tommy. He found her, as usual, at work. She laid down her brush and handed him the water-colour design. "I'm too busy to-day to fool about with this silly nonsense. I can't spare any more time for it. You can carry out the scheme quite as well as I can. You'll find everything there. Do you mind?" Tommy did not mind. In fact, he was delighted at the task. The artist in him loved to deal with things of beauty and exquisite colours. "Shall I give an eye to the wines?" "Everything's quite settled. I saw to it yesterday. Now clear out. I'm busy. And look here," she cried, as he was mounting the staircase, "I'm not going to have you or Etta fooling around the place to-day. I'm going to paint till the very last minute." She resumed her painting. A short while afterwards a note and a parcel came from Etta. From the parcel she drew a long pair of black gloves. She threw them to the maid, Eliza. "What shall I do with them, ma'am?" "Wear 'em at your funeral," said Clementina. A few minutes before 8, Quicksters stood in the great drawing-room waiting to receive his guests. On the stroke came Abel Concannon, scrupulously punctual, and Etta, followed by Tommy, who, having given the last touches to the table, waylaid her on the stairs. Then came Lady Louisa Morling and Lena Fontaine, demure in pale heliotrope. After them, Lord and Lady Radfield, he tall and distinguished, with white moustache and imperial, she much younger than he, dumpy, expensively dressed, wearing a false air of vivacity. Then came in quick succession General and Lady Barnes, Griffiths, Quicksters's colleague in the Anthropological Society, and his wife, John Parsford, the Royal Academician, Mr. and Mrs. Wilmore Jackson, physically polished, vacant, opulent friends of Mrs. Fontaine. Gradually the party assembled, and the hum of talk filled the room. During an interval Quicksters turned to Tommy. What had become of Clementina, who had promised to play hostess? Tommy could give no information. All he knew about her was that he had stopped at her door and offered her a lift in his cab, and Eliza had come down with a verbal message to the effect that he was to go away and that Miss Wing was not coming in his cab. Tommy opined that Clementina was in one of her crotchety humours. Possibly she would not turn up at all. Etta took Tommy aside. "I'm sure that old black frock has split down the back, and Eliza is mending it with black thread." Only the Quinns and Clementina to arrive, and at 10 minutes past the Quinns, Sir Edward, Member of Parliament, and Lady, genial, flustered folk with many apologies for lateness. The hands of the clock on the mantelpiece marked the quarter. Still no Clementina. Quicksters grew uneasy. What could have happened? Lena Fontaine turned from him and whispered to Lord Radfield. "She has forgotten to put on her boots, and is driving back for them." Then Spriggs appeared at the door and announced, "Miss Clementina Wing," and Clementina sailed into the room. For the first and only time in his life did Quicksters lose his courtliness of manner. For a perceptible instant he stood stock-still and stared, open-mouthed. It was a Clementina that he had never seen before, a Clementina that no one had ever seen before. It was Clementina in a 100-guinea gown, gold silk gleaming through ambergris net, Clementina exquisitely corseted and revealing a beautifully curved and rounded figure, Clementina with a smooth, clear, olive skin, with her fine black hair coiled by a miracle of the hairdresser's art majestically on her head, and set off with a great diamond comb. Clementina wearing diamonds at her throat. Clementina perfectly gloved, Clementina carrying an ostrich feather fan, Clementina erect, proud, smiling, her strong face illuminated by her fine eyes a-glitter with suppressed excitement. Clementina, a very great lady, and almost a beautiful woman. Those who knew her stared like Quicksters. Those who did not looked at her appreciatively. She sailed across the room, hand outstretched to Quicksters. "I'm so sorry I'm late, and so sorry I could not run in today. I've been up to my ears in work. I hope Tommy has been a satisfactory lieutenant."
"He has most faithfully carried out your instructions," said Quicksters, recovering his balance.
Clementina smiled on Mrs. Fontaine. "How do you do? How charming to meet you again. But you're looking pale tonight, my dear, quite fagged out. I hope nothing's the matter." She turned round quickly, leaving Lena Fontaine speechless with amazement and indignation, and shook hands with the astonished Admiral. Was this regal-looking woman the same paint-daubed rabbit-skinner of the studio? He murmured vague nothings. "Well, my dears?" Tommy and Etta, thus greeted, stood paralysed before her, like village children at a school feast when they are addressed by the awe-inspiring squire's lady. Pinch me hard," Tommy whispered, when Clementina had turned to meet Lord Radfield, whom Quicksters was presenting. "I believe I have the pleasure of taking you down to dinner," said Lord Radfield. "I'm a sort of brevet hostess in this house," said Clementina. "A bad one, I'm afraid, seeing how late I am." Spriggs announced dinner. Quicksters led the way with Lady Radfield. Clementina, on Lord Radfield's arm, closed the procession. The company took their places in the great dining-room. Quicksters, at the end of the table by the door, sat between Lady Radfield and Lady Louisa. Clementina at the foot between Lord Radfield and General Barnes. Lena Fontaine had her place as near Clementina as possible, between Lord Radfield and Griffiths, a dry, splenetic man who had taken her in. Clementina had thus arranged the table plan. The scheme of decoration was too striking in its beauty not to arouse immediate and universal comment. It was half barbaric. Rich Chinese gold embroideries on the damask, black and gold lacquer urns, a great black and gold lacquer tray, black irises with golden tongues in gold dust Venetian glass, tawny orchids flaring profusely among the black and gold. Here and there, shining through greenery, the glow of golden fruit, and, insistent down the long table, the cool sheen of ambergris grapes. Glass and silver and damask, black and gold and ambergris, audacious, startling, then appealing to the eye as perfect in its harmony. Quickstus and Tommy each proclaimed the author. All eyes were directed to Clementina. Attention was diverted to the name and menu cards. Lord Radfield put his name card into his pocket. "It is not every day in the week that one takes away a precious work of art from a London dinner party." Clementina enjoyed a little triumph, the flush of which mounted to her dark face. With the flush, and in the setting she had prepared for herself, she looked radiant. Her late entrance had produced a dramatic effect. The immediate concentration of everyone on her work, added to the commonplace of her reputation, had at once established her as the central figure in the room, and she sat, as hostess, at the foot of the table, a symphony in ambergris, gold, and black. Woman, in the use of woman's weapons, has evolved no laws of fence. "One might almost have said she did it on purpose," murmured the ingenuous Tommy. "Did what?" asked Etta. "Why, use the table as a personal decoration. Don't you see how it all leads up to her? Leads up, by Jove, to her eyes and the diamonds in her hair. And I say, doesn't it wipe out Mrs. Fontaine?" Tommy was right. Lena Fontaine's pale colouring, her white face and chestnut hair, faded into nothingness against the riot of colour. The pale heliotrope of her dress was killed. She was insignificant to the eye. Conscious of this eclipse, hating herself for having put on heliotrope, and yet wondering which of her usual half-tone costumes she could have worn, she paid her tribute to the designer with acid politeness. She wished she had not come. Clementina as fish-fag and Clementina as princess were two totally different people. She could deal with the one. How could she deal with the other? The irony in Clementina's glance made her quiver with fury. Her heart still burnt her with the indignation of the first greeting. She felt herself to be in the midst of hostile influences. Griffiths, a man of unimaginative fact, plunged headlong into a discourse on comparative statistics of accidents to railway servants. She listened absently, angry with Quickstus for pairing her with so dreary a fellow. Griffiths, irritated by her non-intelligence, transferred the lecture to his other neighbour as soon as an opportunity occurred. Lena Fontaine awaited her chance with Lord Radfield. But Clementina held him amused and interested, and soon drew General Barnes into the talk. With the slough of her old outer trappings, Clementina had cast off the slough of her abrupt and unconventional speech. She was a woman of acute intellect, wide reading, and wide observation. She had ideas and wit, and she had come out this evening flamingly determined to use all her powers. Her success sent her pulses throbbing. Here were two men, at the outset of her experiment, hanging on her words, paying indubitable homage, not to the woman of brains, not to the well-known painter, but to the essential woman herself. The talk quickly became subtle, personal, a quick interchange of hinted sentiment that makes for charm. When Lord Radfield at last turned to Lena Fontaine, she could offer him nothing but commonplaces: Goodwood, a scandal or so, the fortunes of a bridge club. Clementina adroitly brought them both quickly into her circle, and Lena Fontaine had the chagrin to see the politely bored old face suddenly lit up with reawakened interest. For a moment or two Lena Fontaine flashed into the talk, determined to offer battle. But after a while she felt dominated, cowed, with no fight left in her. The other woman ruled triumphant. Tommy could not keep his eyes off Clementina, and neglected Etta and his left-hand neighbour shamefully. An unprecedented rosiness of fingernails caught his keen vision. In awe-stricken tones he whispered to Etta, "Manicured!" "Go on with your dinner," said Etta, "and don't stare, Tommy, it's rude." "She should have given us warning," groaned Tommy. "We're too young to stand it." The exquisitely cooked and served meal proceeded. The French chef whom Clementina had engaged, and to whom she had given full scope for his art, had felt like an architect unrestricted by site or expense, who can put into concrete form the dreams of a lifetime. John Parsford, the sculptor, sitting next to Lady Louisa, cried out to his host, "This is not a dinner you've given us, Crixtus, it's a poem." Lady Louisa ate on, too much absorbed in flavours for articulate thought.
Crixtus smiled. "I'm not responsible. The mistress of the feast is facing me at the other end."
Parsford, who knew the Clementina of everyday life, threw up his hands in a Latin gesture which he had learned at the Beaux-Arts, and of which he was proud.
"The most remarkable woman of the century." "I think you're right," said Crixtus.
He looked down at the table and caught her eye and exchanged smiles. Now that he could adjust his mind to the concept of Clementina transfigured, he felt conscious of a breathless admiration. He grew absurdly impatient of the social conventions which pinned him in his seat, leagues of lacquer and orchids away from her. Idiotic envy of the two men whom she was fascinating by her talk entered his heart. She was laughing, showing her white, strong teeth, as only once before she had shown her teeth to him. He longed to escape from the vivaciously inane Lady Radfield and join the group at the other end of the table. Now and then his eye rested on Nina Fontaine, but she had almost faded out of sight. At the end of the dinner he held the door open for the ladies to pass out. Clementina, immediately preceded by Etta, whispered a needless recommendation not to linger. The door closed. Etta put her arm round Clementina's waist. "Oh, darling, you look too magnificent for words. But why didn't you tell me? Why did you make a fool of me about the old black dress?" Clementina disengaged the girl's arm gently. "My child," she said, "if I have the extra pressure of a feather on me, I'll yell. I'm suffering the tortures of the damned." "Oh, poor darling." "It's worth it, though," said Clementina. When the men came upstairs, she again enjoyed a triumph. Men and women crowded round her and ministered instinctively to her talk. All the pent-up emotions, longings, laughter of years found torrential utterance. Parsford, standing over her, was amazed to discover how shapely were her bare arms, and how full and graceful her neck and shoulders. Crixtus talked for a few moments with the spotless flower of womanhood. In the stiff formality of the drawing-room she regained her individuality. With a resumption of her air of possession, she patted a vacant seat on the couch beside her, and invited him to sit down. He obeyed. "I thought you were going to neglect me altogether," she said. He protested courteously. They sparred a little. Then Wilmore Jackson, polished and opulent, eyeglass in eye, crossed over to the couch, and Crixtus, rising with an eagerness that made Lina Fontaine bite her lip, yielded him the seat and joined the charmed circle around Clementina. A little thrill of pleasure passed through him as she glanced a welcome. He gazed at her, fascinated. Something magnetic, feminine, he was too confused to know what, emanated from her and held him bound. Never in all the years of his knowledge of her had she appealed to him in this extraordinary manner. Why had the perfect neck and arms, the graceful figure been hidden under shapeless garments? Why had the magnificence of her hair never been revealed? Why had grim frown and tightened lips locked within the features the laughter that now played about them? Once he had seen her face illuminated, at the hotel in Marseille, but then it was with generous and noble feeling, and he had forgotten the disfiguring attire. But now she had the stateliness of a queen, and men hung around her, irresistibly attracted. At last Lady Radfield disentangled her lord and departed. Others followed her example. The party broke up with the curious suddenness of London. In a brief interval between adieux, Crixtus and Clementina found themselves alone together. "Well," she asked, "are you pleased?"
"Pleased? What a word! I'm dumbfounded. I've been blind, and my eyes are open. I never knew you before."
"Because I have a decent gown on. I couldn't do less."
"Because," said he, "I never knew what a beautiful woman you were."
The blood flew to her dark cheeks. She touched his arm and looked at him. "Do you really think I look nice?" His reply was cut short by the Quins coming up to take leave, but she read it on his face. The room thinned. Lena Fontaine came up. "It's getting late. I must rescue Louisa and go. Your dinner party was quite a success, Dr. Quickstus." "So glad you think so," said Clementina, "especially now that I hear you were originally responsible for it. It was most kind of you to think of our dear young people. But don't go yet. Lady Louisa is quite happy with Mr. Griffiths. He's feeding her with facts. Let us sit down for a minute or two and chat comfortably." She moved to a sofa near by, and motioned Mrs. Fontaine to a seat. The latter had to yield. Quickstus drew up a chair. "I've done a desperate thing," said Clementina. "I've taken the old manor house at Moldham-on-Thames for August and September. It's as big as a hotel, and unless I fill it with people I shall be lost in it. Now everyone who wants to paint can have a studio. I myself am going to paint every morning, and anyone who wants to write can have a library. Sheila has picked out the library for you, Ephraim. Takes it for granted that you are coming. I hope you will. You'll break her heart if you don't. And there'll be a room for Mr. Huckabee, too. There'll be Etta and Tommy, of course, and the Admiral has promised to put in a week or two, and so on. And if you'll only come and stay August with me, my dear Mrs. Fontaine, my cup of happiness, unlike my house, will be full." Lena Fontaine gasped for an outraged moment. Then a swift, fierce temptation assailed her to take the enemy at her word and fight the battle. But, glancing at her, she saw the irony and banter and deadly purpose behind the glittering eyes, and her courage failed her. She was dominated again by the intense personality, frightened by her sudden and unexpected power. To stay under the woman's roof was an impossibility. "I'm sorry I can't accept such a charming invitation," she said with a smile of the lips, "for I've made an engagement with some friends to go to Dinar." "Oh, you're going to Dinar too?" cried Clementina. "What do you mean by too?" asked the other shortly. "I heard a rumour that Dr. Quickstus was going there. It seemed so silly that I paid no attention to it. Are you really going, Ephraim?" It was a trap deliberately laid. It was a defiance, a challenge. From the corner of the sofa she stretched out her bare arm at full length and laid her hand on his shoulder. The other woman looked white and pinched. Her eyes lost their allurement and regarded him almost with enmity. "You promised." The words were snapped out before she could realize their significance. The instant after she could have thrust hat-pins into herself in punishment for folly. The manhood in Quickstus leapt at the lash. He knew then, with a startling clarity of assurance, that nothing in the world would induce him to strut about casinos with her in Dinar. He smiled courteously. "Pardon me, dear Mrs. Fontaine. I made no promise. You must remember my little trophy of the door and the peacocks." Clementina, satisfied, withdrew her hand. "Of course, dear Ephraim, if you prefer to go to Dinar with Mrs. Fontaine." Lena Fontaine rose. "Dr. Quickstus is obviously free to do what he chooses. I wish you would kindly leave me out of it." Clementina rose too and held out her hand. "I will, my dear Mrs. Fontaine," she said sweetly, "if I can. Good-bye. It has been so delightful to have had you." Her exit with Lady Louisa was confused with that of other stragglers. The Admiral, Etta, and Tommy remained. They all went down to Quickstus's study, the little back room of the adventure of the drunken housekeeper, now cheery with decanters and siphons and cigarettes, and chatted intimately, till the Admiral reminded Etta that the horses, "such fat horses," murmured Etta, had been standing for nearly an hour. Tommy accompanied father and daughter to the carriage. Quickstus and Clementina were left alone. "Can I tell Sheila tomorrow that you're coming down to Moldham?" "I think you can," said Quickstus. "I think you can, quite safely." "I'm sorry Mrs. Fontaine wasn't able to join us." "Now why?" he asked, vaguely conscious of outstretched claw and flying fur. "Because she has such brilliant social gifts," replied Clementina. There was a span of silence. Clementina inhaled a puff of the Turkish cigarette she had lit, and then threw it into the grate.
For God's sake, my dear man, look in that drawer and give me some tobacco I can smoke. I smuggled it in yesterday." Quicksters gave her the yellow package and papers, and she rolled a cigarette of Maryland and smoked contentedly. Tommy came in. "Will you and these infants lunch with me tomorrow at the Carlton?" "With pleasure," said Quicksters. "Do you know," she said, "I've never been inside the place. It'll be quite an adventure." A few moments later Tommy and herself were speeding westward in a taxicab. The boy spoke little. All his darling conceptions of Clementina had been upheaved, dynamited, tossed into the air, and lay around him in amorphous fragments. Nor was she conversationally inclined. Tommy now was a tiny little speck in her horizon. Yet when the motor drew up at her house in Romney Place, and he opened the gate for her, something significant happened. He put out his hand. "Good night, Clementina." She laughed. "Where are your manners, Tommy? Aren't you going to kiss me?" He hesitated just the fraction of a second, and then kissed her. She ran up to her room, exultant, not because she had been kissed, far from it, but because he had hesitated. Between Clementina Fishfag and Clementina Princess was a mighty gulf. She knew it. She exulted. She went to bed, but could not sleep. She had a headache, such a headache, a glorious headache, a thunder and lightning of a headache. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of The Glory of Clementina Wing by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 24. Tommy, calling for Clementina the next morning, was confronted at the open door, not by Eliza, but by a demure damsel in a black frock, black apron, and a black bow in her hair, who said, "Oui, monsieur," when addressed. Tommy, still bewildered, asked whether she was a new lady's maid. "Oui, monsieur," said the damsel, and showed him into the Sheraton drawing-room. He sat down meekly and waited for Clementina. She came down soon, a resplendent vision, exquisitely gowned, perfectly hatted, delicately gloved, and in her hand she jingled a small goldsmith's shop. She pirouetted round. "Like it?" Tommy groaned. "Clementina, darling, tell me in heaven's name what you're playing at, or I'll go raving mad." "I told you that one of these days I was going to become a lady. The day has come. Don't I look like a lady?" "That's the devil of it," he laughed. "You look like an archduchess." They picked up at her and met Quicksters at the Carlton, where they lunched in the middle of the great gay room. The young people's curious awe of the transmogrified Clementina soon melted away. The big, warm-hearted Clementina they loved was unchanged, but to her was added a laughter-evoking, brilliant, joyous personage whose existence they had never suspected. Quicksters went home stimulated and uplifted. He had never enjoyed 2 hours so much in his life. And that was the beginning of the glory of Clementina Wing. Day by day the glory deepened. The pyrotechnic, a flash, a bedazzlement, and then darkness, was not in Clementina's nature. She had deliberately immolated the phoenix of dusky plumage, and from its ashes had arisen this second and radiant phoenix incarnation. She suffered, as she confessed to herself, infernally, for a new far-born phoenix must have its skin peculiarly tender, but she grinned and bore it for the greater glory, well, not of Clementina alone, but of God and her sex and the happiness of those she loved, and the things that stood for right. She was fighting the interloping woman with her own weapons. She, Clementina, the despised and rejected of men, was pitting her sex's fascinations against the professional seductress. She had won the first pitched battle. She had swept the enemy from the field. Sheer fierceness of love, almost animal, for the child. Sheer pity flaming white for the man grown dear to her. Sheer sex, sheer womanhood, these were the forces at work. It would have been easy to denounce the woman to Quicksters, but that might have thrown him back into darkness. Easy, too, to have held her knowledge as a threat over the woman's head and bade her begone. But where had been the triumph? Where the glory? Whereas to scorn the use of her knowledge and conquer otherwise, therein lay matter for thrilling exultation. It was an achievement worth the struggle. And the glory of the riot through her veins of the tumultuous thing she had kept strangled to torpor within her. the thing that had been stirred by the springtide in a girl's heart, that had leapt at the parrot tulips in the early May, that had almost escaped from grip on the moonlight night at Vienne, that had remained awake and struggling ever since, the glory to let it go free and carry her whithersoever it would. Art? To the devil with it! What was art in comparison with this new-found glory? It made her 10 years younger. It took years from the man for whose fascination she brought it into play. Hers was a double conquest, the rout of the woman, the capture of the man. Daily she battled. Sheila, the lovers, a new portrait of him which she suddenly conceived the splendid notion of painting, all were pretexts for keeping the unconscious man within the sphere of her influence. Any impression that the others had made on his heart or his mind should be deleted, and her impression stamped there in its place, so that when he met the other out of her presence, as meet her he undoubtedly must, he would wear it as a talisman against her arts and blandishments. Twice also during the dying days of the season, late that year, she went out into the great world and gave her adversary battle in the open. It was between these two engagements that she had a talk with Huckabee. Huckabee, doing his best to act loyally towards both parties, led a precarious moral existence. The sight of Clementina queening it in dazzling raiment about Quickstus's house, and the despairing confidences of Lena Fontaine, had enabled him to form a fairly accurate judgment of the state of affairs. His heart began to bleed for Lena Fontaine. She would come to his lodgings and claim sympathy. To not a soul in the world but him could she talk freely. She was desperate. That abominable woman insulted her, trampled on her, poisoned Quickstus's mind against her. He had changed suddenly, seemed to avoid her, and when he found himself in her company, he was just polite and courteous in his gentle way, and smilingly eluded her. The dinar intimacy on which she had reckoned had faded into the land of dreams. He was being dragged off before her eyes to some fool place up the river to be watched and guarded like a lunatic. What was she to do? Ruin would soon be staring her in the face. She had thought of upbraiding him for neglect, of reproaching him for having played fast and loose with her affections, of putting him through the ordeal of an emotional scene. Of that, however, she was afraid. It might scare him away for good and all. She wept, an unhappy and ill-treated woman, and Huckabee supplied sympathy and handkerchiefs and a mirror so that she could repair the ravages of tears. One day Huckabee and Clementina met in the hall of the Russell Square house. "Well," she said, "have you seen Mrs. Fontaine lately?" He admitted that he had. "Taking it rather badly, I suppose?" she remarked, with a reversion to her grim manner. "She's miserable. As I told you, it means all the world to her, her very salvation." Clementina caught the note of deep pleading in his voice, and fixed him with her shrewd eyes. "You seem to concern yourself very deeply about the lady." Huckabee glanced at her for a moment, hesitatingly, then shrugged his shoulders. Clementina was a woman to whom straight dealing counted for righteousness. He gave her his secret. "I've grown to care for her very much. I know I'm a fool, but I can't help it." "Do you know anything of the lady's private affairs, financial, I mean? How much she has honestly of her own?" "400 a year. And you?" "When I take up the appointment of the Anthropological Society, I shall have 500. £900. Have you any idea of the minimum rate per annum at which she would accept salvation?" "No," said Huckabee in a dazed way. "Well, work it out," said Clementina. "Good-bye." Her second sortie into the great world was on the occasion of a garden party at the Quinns. Lady Quinn had asked her verbally at Quickstus's dinner, and had sent her a formal card. Knowing that Quickstus was going, and more than suspecting that the enemy would be there too, she kept her own invitation a secret. Welcomed, flattered, surrounded by the gay crowd in the large, pleasant Hampstead garden, it was some time before she saw Mrs. Fontaine. At last she caught sight of her sitting with Quickstus at the end of the garden, half screened by a tree-trunk from the mass of guests. As soon as Clementina could work her way through, she advanced quickly and smiling towards them. Quickstus sprang to his feet and seemed to take a deep breath, as a man does when he flings bedroom windows wide open on his first morning in mountain air. "Clementina, I had the dimmest notion that you were coming. How delightful!" He surveyed her for a moment as she stood before him, parasol on shoulder. Clementina with a parasol.
"Pray forgive my impertinence," said he, "but you are wearing the most beautiful dress I ever saw."
It was hand-painted muslin, a fabulous thing. She laughed, turned to Lina Fontaine, demure in a simple fawn costume. "He's improving. Have you ever known him to compliment a woman on her dress before?" "Many times," said Mrs. Fontaine mendaciously. "It must be your excellent training," said Clementina. She turned to Quicksters. "I've seen Huckabee this morning, and everything's quite arranged for the transportation of your necessary books and specimens down to Moleham. He'll do it beautifully, even though it takes a Pantechnicon van, and you won't be worried about it at all. He's a splendid fellow."
"He is rendering me invaluable assistance."
"Dr. Quicksters tells me he's quite an old friend of yours, Mrs. Fontaine," said Clementina. "What a pity you can't be persuaded to come down to Moleham. Are you going to have a chaperone to your rather mixed house party?" "I should, if you would honour me by coming. My dear Mrs. Fontaine, a dowager dragon of propriety. But an admiral of the British Navy is quite safeguard enough for me." The hostess, coming through the edge of the crowd, carried off Quicksters. The two women were left alone. Lina Fontaine turned suddenly, white-lipped, shaking with anger. "I've had enough of it. I'm not going to stand it. I'm not going to be persecuted like this any longer." "What will you do?" Lina Fontaine clenched her small hands. What could she do? "Come, come," said Clementina. "Let us have a straight talk, like sensible women, and put the pussy-cat aside if we can. Sit down, do. There's only one point of dissension between us. You know very well what it is. There's no use fencing. Give it up. Give up all idea of it, and I'll let you alone. Give it all up. You can see for yourself that I won't let you do it." "It's outrageous for you to speak to me like this," said the other, half hysterically. "I know it is," said Clementina coolly. "I'm an outrageous woman, been so all my life. To do an outrageous thing is only part of the day's work. So I just say, outrageously, give it up." Lina Fontaine fluttered a glance at the strong face, and caught the magnetism of the black glittering eyes, and remained silent. She knew that she was no match for this vital creature. She was confronting overwhelming odds. The rough fish-fag of Paris, who could walk straight into the mould of a great lady, and carry everything contemptuously before her, suddenly impressed her with a paralyzing sense of something uncanny, relentless, irresistible. She was less a woman than an implacable force. For the first time in her life of hagerdom, Lina Fontaine felt beaten. The nun's face grew drawn and haggard. Fright replaced the allurement of her eyes. She said nothing, but twisted one gloved hand nervously in the other. She was at the mercy of the victor. There was silence for some moments. Then Clementina's heart smote her. All this elaborate wheel to break a butterfly, a very naughty, sordid, frayed, and empty little butterfly, but still a butterfly. "My dear," she said at last very gently, "I know how hard life is on a lone and defenceless woman. I know you have had many reasons to hate me for preventing you from making that life softer and sweeter. But perhaps one of these days you mayn't hate me so much. I'm every infernal thing you like to call me, and when I'm interfered with I'm a devil. But at heart I'm a woman, and a good sort. I won't outrage you by saying such an idiot thing as 'let us be friends,' when you've every rational desire to murder me. But I ask you to remember, and I've suffered enough not to be a silly fool going round saying serious things I don't mean, I ask you to remember that if ever you want a woman to turn to, you can count on me. I'm a good bit older than you," she added generously. "I'm 36. "My God!" cried the other, bursting into tears. "I'm 37. "Impossible!" said Clementina in genuine amazement. "You look nothing like it." She rose and touched the weeping woman's shoulder. "Anyhow," she said, "I've a certain amount of female horse sense that might come in useful if you want it." Whereupon Clementina made her way straight through the throng to her hostess, and after a swift farewell left the garden party. The enemy was finally routed, the confession of age a confession of defeat. The victory had been achieved much more easily than she had anticipated. When she went home, She looked with a queer smile into one of the hanging wardrobes with which she had been obliged to furnish her bedroom so as to accommodate the prodigious quantity of new dresses. Why all the lavish expenditure, the feverish preparation, the many hours wasted at great dressmakers, modistes, and other vendors of frippery? Why the hairdressers, the face specialists? Why the exquisite torture of tight lacing? Why the responsibility of valuable jewels, her mother's, up till then safely stored at the bank? Why the renting of the caravanserai at Molum? Why the revolution of her habits, her modes of expression, her very life? Why, in short, such fantastic means to gain so simple an end? Was it worth it? Clementina slammed the wardrobe door and glanced at herself in the long mirror that was exposed. She saw a happy woman, and she laughed. It was worth it. She gained infinitely more than a victory over a poor sister of no account. Sheila came running into the room. "Oh, what a beautiful auntie!" She caught the child to her and hugged her close. The legal formalities with regard to Will Hammersley's affairs were eventually concluded, but in spite of all inquiries, the identity of Sheila's mother remained a curious mystery. No record of Hammersley's marriage could be found, either at Somerset House or at Shanghai. No reference to his wife appeared in the papers he had left behind him. At last, a day or two before her departure for Molum, Clementina made a discovery. A trunk of Hammersley's, merely containing suits of clothes and other wearing apparel, had remained undisposed of, and Clementina was going through them with the object of packing them off to some charitable association, when from the folds of a jacket there dropped a bundle of letters tied round with a bit of tape. She glanced idly at the outer sheet. The handwriting was a woman's. The few words that met her eyes showed that they were love letters. Clementina sat on an empty packing-case. All Hammersley's personal belongings had been dumped in her box-room, and balanced the bundle in her hand. They were sacred things belonging to the hearts of the dead. Ought she to read them? Yet she became conscious of a feminine intuition that they might hold a secret that would bring comfort to the living. So she undid the tape and spread out the old crumpled pages, and as she read, a tragedy, a romance as old as the world, was revealed to her. The letters dated from 7 years back. They were from one Nora Duglade, a woman wretchedly married, breaking her heart for Will Hammersley. Clementina read on. Suddenly she gave a sharp cry of astonishment and leaped to her feet. There was a reference to Angela Quickstus, who was in her confidence. Clementina rapidly scanned page after page and found more and more of Angela. The writer, like most women, could not bear to destroy their beloved letters. She dared not keep them at home. Angela had lent her a drawer in her bureau. Clementina telephoned to Quickstus to come immediately on urgent business. In 20 minutes he arrived, somewhat scared. Was anything wrong with Sheila? "I found out who her mother was," said Clementina. "Who was she?" he asked quickly. She bade him sit down. They were in the drawing-room. "Someone called Nora Duglade. I don't remember her." Quickstus passed his hand over his forehead as he threw back his thoughts. "Mrs. Duglade," he said in bewilderment. "Mrs. Duglade." "A friend of Angela's," said Clementina. "Yes, a school friend. They saw very little of each other. I met her only once or twice. I had no notion Hammersley knew her. Her husband was a brute, I remember, used to beat her. I think I heard she had left him." "For Will Hammersley?" "He died years ago. Of drink. Ugh!" He shuddered and hid his face in his hands. "Read these few pages," said Clementina, and she left the room very quietly. About 10 minutes afterwards she came in again. He sprang up from his chair and grasped both her hands. His eyes were wet and his lips worked tremulously. "I found a letter from Hammersley in Angela's drawer. It had got stuck at the back. It was for the other woman, my dear." His voice quavered into the treble. It was for the other woman." She led him to the stiff sofa and sat beside him and held his hand. And she had the joy of seeing a black cloud melt away from a man's soul. From that hour when he had revealed to her the things deep and sacred, dark and despairing of his heart, and had gone forth from her sympathy aglow with a new-found faith in humanity, the bond between them was strengthened 1,000-fold. Quickstus found that he could obtain not only swift response to his thoughts from a keen intelligence, but wide,
undreamed-of understanding of all those subtle workings of the spirit, regrets, hopes, judgments, prejudices, shrinkings, wonderings, impulses, which are too elusive to be thoughts, too vague to be emotions. And yet she herself was never subtle. She was direct and uncompromising. As a shivering man enters a cosy room and warms himself before a blazing fire, so did he unquestionably warm his heart in Clementina's personality. And as the shivering man knows, without speculating, that the fire is intense and strong, so did he know that Clementina was intense and strong. All through the idyll of the remaining summer he felt this more and more. She stood for something that he had missed in life, something that Angela, pale, passionless, negative reflection of himself, had never given him. She stood for richness, bigness, meaning. A simple man, not given to introspection or analysis of motive, new sensations, new realizations came to him as they come to a child and caused development. And among other impressions that deepened on his mind, and his was the mind of a scholar and dreamer, sweet and clean, was that of Clementina, now appearing to the world as God Almighty intended her to appear, as a physically fine and splendid creature. And, during all the summer idyll in the manor house at Modum-on-Thames, Clementina, in her uncompromising way, maintained the new phoenix's plumage preened and shiny. The old habit of clawing at her hair while she was painting she circumvented by tying her head in an Angelica Kaufmann handkerchief. Tommy made her a present of one in cardinal red, in which she flamed gypsy-like about the studio. Involuntarily, inevitably, the manner of all men in her house-party, Quicksters, Huckabee, Applecon Cannon, Pointer, who spent a week-end, Tommy, and Tommy's cronies, who came and went as they pleased, was tinged with a deference and a homage which made life a thing of meaning and delight. Sometimes a little scene like this would take place. To Clementina, painting hard in the morning, entered the housekeeper. "Please, ma'am, we'll soon be out of wine." "Please, ma'am, we'll soon be out of wine." She would frown at the canvas. "Well, what of it?" "The gentlemen, ma'am." "Oh, let them drink ginger beer." "Very well, ma'am." Then with a laugh she would fling down her brushes and go and attend to her cellar. To make the men in her house comfortable, the commonplace care of a hostess, gave her unimagined pleasure. Etta and her young friends could look after themselves, being females and therefore resourceful. But the men were helpless children, even the Admiral, sometimes she thought especially the Admiral. Their nourishment became a matter of peculiar solicitude. She invented wants for them which she forthwith supplied. Sometimes she summoned Tommy to consultation, but when he gravely prescribed a large Bath powder-puff for his uncle, she upbraided him for making a jest of solemn things and dismissed him from her counsels. Her paintings suffered from these inroads on her time and thoughts, but Clementina cared not. The happiness of the trustful men around her was of more consequence than the successful application of paint to canvas. Sometimes, sitting at the head of her table, she would feel herself a mother to them all, and her lips would twist themselves into a new smile. Her happiest hours were those which she spent alone with Sheila and Quicksters. Since the cloud had been lifted from his soul, he loved the child with a new tenderness, thus inarticulately expressing his gratitude to God for having put into his heart to love her while the cloud hung heavy. And Clementina knew this, and invested his relations with the child in a curious sanctity. She loved to share with him the child's affection in actual physical presence. The late afternoon was Sheila's hour. Clementina would sit with them beneath the great cedar tree on the lawn, and listen to the stories he had learned to pour into Sheila's insatiable ears. They were mostly odds and ends of folklore, but now and then she suspected heterogeneous strains. And one day she called out, "Are you inventing all that, Ephraim?" He confessed with the air of a detected schoolboy. "To hear you playing the deuce with folklore which you regard as a strict and sacred science amazes me. From you it sounds almost immoral." Quicksters fingered the soft curls. "What," he said, "is all the science in the world compared with this little head?" Clementina was silent for a moment. Then she said abruptly, "You feel like that too, do you?" Quicksters nodded and dreamed over the curls. "But what happened to the princess and the juju man?" demanded Sheila, and Quicksters had to pursue his immoral course. August melted into September, and September drew to its close. Admiral Concannon and Etta and all the boys and girls, save Tommy, had gone, and Huckabee was busy with the repacking of books and specimens. The weather had broken. The trees dripped with rain, and the leaves began to fall. Mists rose from the meadows by the river, and a blue haze, sweet and sad, enveloped the low-lying hills. In the garden the sunflowers, a week before so glorious, hung their heads with a dying grace. The birds, even the thrushes, were mute. The hour under the cedar tree had become the hour of deepening twilight by the fireside. The idyll was over. London called. They had been sitting before the drawing-room fire for a long time without speaking. Sheila, with a toy shop and an army of dolls for customers, played on the floor between them, absorbed in her game. No one of the three noticed that darkness had crept into the room, for the fire leaped and flamed, throwing on them fierce lights and shadows. "The day after tomorrow," said Clementina, breaking the silence and looking intently at the blaze. "Yes," said Quicksters, "the day after tomorrow." "I think you'll find I've made all arrangements for Sheila. Atkins understands." Atkins was the nurse. "I've seen about the nursery fender, which I'd overlooked. You mustn't let Atkins bully you, or she'll get out of hand. How these 3 months have flown!" "If you didn't insist," said Quicksters, "I wouldn't take her from you, but you'll miss her terribly." "So will you when my turn comes again," replied Clementina gruffly. "What's the good of talking rubbish?" There was another silence. He glanced at her, and a sudden flame from the fire lit up her face, and he saw that her brows were bent and her mouth set grimly tight, and that something glistened for a second on each cheek and then fell quickly. And each time he glanced at her he saw the same glistening drop fall. "Uncle Ephraim," said Sheila, coming and insinuating herself between his legs, "Mrs. Brown wants to buy some matches, and I haven't got any." He gave her his silver matchbox, and Sheila went away, happy to her game. Clementina choked a sob. "My dear," said he at last. "Yes," said Clementina. "Why shouldn't we have her always with us?" "You mean," said Clementina after a pause, and still looking into the fire, "even with her I can't face that great lonely house. I can't face my empty, lonely existence. My dear," said he, bending forward in his chair, "it has come to this, that I can't think a thought or feel an emotion without you becoming inextricably interwoven with it. You have grown into the texture of my life. I know I may be impertinent and presumptuous in putting such a proposal before you." "You haven't put one yet," said Clementina. "It is that you would do me the honour of marrying me," replied Quicksters. Again there was silence. For the first time in her life she was afraid to speak, lest she should betray the commotion in her being. She loved him. She did not hide the fact from herself. It was not the mad, gorgeous passion of romance. She knew it for something deeper, stronger, based on essentials. He lay deeply rooted in her heart, half child for her mothering, all man for her loving. When had she begun to care for him? She scarcely knew. Perhaps at Marseilles, when he had returned to her for companionship, and they walked out arm in arm. She knew that he spoke truly of his need of her. But the words that mattered, the foolish little words, he had not uttered. "Do you care for me enough to marry me?" she asked at last. He glanced at Sheila weighing out matches in her toy scales. It is difficult to carry on a love scene with conviction in the presence of a third party, even of that of a beloved child of 5. "Very, very deeply," he said in a low voice. The dressing bell rang, and Clementina rose. "Put up your shop, darling. It's time to go to bed." Then she crossed to Quicksters's chair, and stood behind him, and laid one arm on his shoulder. He kissed her hand. "Well?" said he, looking up. "I'll tell you presently," she said, and in withdrawing her hand she lightly brushed his cheek.
Quickstus dressed quickly and came down early to the drawing-room, and soon Clementina appeared. She was wearing a red dress which she had bought during her wholesale purchase of raiment, but had never yet worn, thinking it too flaring, and she had a red dahlia in her hair. Quickstus took both her hands and raised them to his shoulders, and she stood away from him at the distance of her bare, shapely arms, and she smiled into his eyes. "Your answer?" said he. "Tell me," she said, "what do you really want me for?" "For yourself," he cried, and he caught her in his arms with swift passion, and kissed her. "If you hadn't said that," she remarked a few moments afterwards, "I don't know what my answer would have been. At any rate," she added, touching her hair with uplifted hands, "it would not have been quite so spontaneous." He leaned his elbow on the mantelpiece, and a great light came into his pale blue eyes as he looked at her. "Do you think, my dear," said he, "that I'm such a dry stick of a man as not to want you for your great self, your great, splendid, and wonderful self? I want you with everything in me." She turned half aside, and said gently, "That's all a woman wants, Ephraim." "What?" "To be wanted," said Clementina. It was not till the next day that she told Tommy the great news. She took him for a walk, and broke it to him bluntly. But he was prepared for it. Etta had foreseen and had prophesied to his sceptical ears. He murmured well-bred congratulations. "But your painting," said he, after a while. "It can go hang," said Clementina. She laughed at his look of horror. "Art for the polygamous man and the celibate woman. A man can throw his soul into his pictures and also attend to his wife and family. That's out of a woman's power. She must choose between her art on the one side and husband and children on the other. I'm telling you this, mon petit, for your education. I've chosen husband and children, as any woman with blood in her veins would choose. It's the women without blood that choose art. Don't make any mistake about it. Now and then one of 'em chooses the other, and as she doesn't get any children and doesn't know what the deuce to do with her husband, falls back on her art again and gives the poor devil soup with camel-hair brushes floating about it and a painting rag for a napkin. And then there are ructions, and she goes among her weary pals and says that their sex is misunderstood and downtrodden, and they must clamour for their rights. Bosh!" She sniffed in her old way. Tommy insisted. "But you're a born painter, Clementina, a great painter. It means such a tremendous sacrifice." "You young men of the present day make me tired," she exclaimed. "You all seem to think that larks ought to fall ready roasted into your mouth. There's not a blessed thing in this world worth having without sacrifice. The big people, the people that have the big things in life, are those that have paid, or are prepared to pay, the big price for them." "I don't see why you should round on me like that," said Tommy. "After all, a little while ago I made no bones about sacrificing the loaves and fishes for the sake of my art. I don't want to brag, but fiat justitia at any rate." "I know what you did," said Clementina, mollified, "and if you hadn't done it I shouldn't be talking like this to you. And you're a painter, and my very dear Tommy, and you can understand. Of course I'll go on painting. I've got it in my blood. I could no more do without a paintbrush handy than a toothbrush. But it's going to be secondary. I'll be the gifted amateur. Clementina Wing, painter of portraits to the nobility, gentry, mayoralty, and pork butchery of Great Britain and Ireland, is dead. You can paraphrase the epitaph. Here lies Clementina Wing, the married woman. And Tommy, my dear," she added in a softer voice, "you can add to it, sic utur ad astra." "I do hope you'll be jolly happy," said Tommy. On their way back it happened that the postman met them with the household budget. She took the letters into the hall and sorted them. Tommy went off with his precious epistle from Etta. Huckabee appeared in quest of his chief's correspondence, and, seeing her alone, congratulated her on her approaching marriage. She thanked him, and held out a letter addressed to him from Dinar. "I've been dealing in quotations lately," she said, "and I find I've got one for you. Go thou and do likewise." Huckabee sighed and laughed. "One of these days, perhaps," said he. So the idyll that seemed to be coming to an end had only just begun. They returned to London, and while Clementina, in whose charge Sheila now remained, painted frenziedly to finish the work she had in hand, Quicksters, with her help, reorganized the great gaunt house in Russell Square. The worm-eaten scarecrow of a billiard table was removed from the billiard room built by Quicksters's father over the garden at the back of the house, and the room, spacious and top-lighted, was converted into a studio for the bride-to-be. Tommy, enthusiastically iconoclast, being given authority under Clementina's directions to refurnish condemned rep curtains, mahogany mid-Victorian furniture, a dining-room sideboard disfigured by carvings of plethoric fruit had sent shivers down his back since infancy, Turkey carpets and all the gloom of a bygone age, and converted the grim abode into a bower of delight. And towards the end of October the oddly mated pair were married, and Clementina went to her husband's home, and the patter of the feet of the beloved child of their adoption was heard about the house, and great joy fell upon them. One day in the early spring Quicksters burst into the studio, a letter in hand. The greatest of all honours that the civilized world has to give to the scholar had fallen on him, honorary membership of the Institut de France. She must know of it at once. She was sitting before the easel, a bit of charcoal in hand, absorbed in her drawing. What he saw on the drawing paper put for the moment the Institute of France out of his mind. Two arms came from the vague, headless trunk of a draped woman. One arm clasped Sheila, a living portrait, and the other something all chubby, kissable curves, such as Murillo had rendered immortal. As soon as she was aware of his presence, she tore the sheet from the board and looked at him somewhat defiantly. He went up and put his arm round her, deeply moved. "My dear," said he, "I saw. You're the only woman in the world that could have done it. Let me look. I can share it with you, dear." She yielded. His delicate perception of the innermost sweetnesses of life was infinitely dear to her. She set the drawing upright on the ledge. He drew a chair close to her and sat down, and he forgot the crowning glory of his intellectual life. "It's not bad of Sheila, is it?" she said. "And the other?" She kissed him. "The very image. It's bound to be." Presently she laughed and said, "I've been thinking of the good St. Paul lately. He has a lot to say about glory. Do you remember? About the glory of celestial bodies and bodies terrestrial. There is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars. But there is one glory which that eminent bachelor never dreamed of." "And what is that, my dear?" asked Quicksters. "The glory of being a woman," said Clementina. End of chapter 24. End of The Glory of Clementina Wing.